A bright sky that stages a frantic chase, the tailing of Sonic's longtime nemesis, Dr. Eggman. The visuals are of gorgeous CG animations handled by Marza Studios. There's a sweeping orchestral score, perfectly timed to reflect the varying moments of adrenaline, provided by the wonderful execution of such a simple scrimmage between two enemies. Sonic and Tails are convincing in their concern for saving the woodland creatures that the Mad Doctor has captured once again. He threatens to let the animals plunge to the land far below, and a valiant attempt from Sonic saving the animals is a failure, with a clean and smooth animation showing his reaction to his own loss. Orbot and Cubot intrude on Eggman's personal space with a cartoon-like feel to the clutter, prompting Eggman to throw them out of his way so that he can fire a laser at the tornado. Akin to Sonic Adventure, the tornado is badly affected by the blast, and the protagonists scramble as they dive through the clouds. Sonic and Tails discover something absurd: the appearance of a floating land known as the Lost Hex. Those of you who have been following my channel for a while will know that I'm quite a fan of the Sonic series, and I've reviewed a few of the games already. While I would like to eventually start back with Sonic 1 and maybe work my way through the main series, there are a couple of obstacles. I have already gone out of order, and I will need to skip over the entries I've already covered when the time comes. And most importantly for this video, I find Lost World to be such a fascinating case study, so much so that I feel I need to analyze the game in depth now, while bringing in context from the greater Sonic series as needed. So while I don't have a well-known, long-running Sonic retrospective series going into this, please consider the video from the perspective of a longtime fan who's played just about every Sonic game out there. Anyway, let's return to the focus of the video. Sonic Lost World is the 12th 3D platforming entry in the Sonic the Hedgehog series, and it released on the Nintendo Wii U in 2013 to mixed reception. This entry has received increased disdain from fans in recent years, but the critical and fan responses were more nuanced in 2013 by comparison. Still, Lost World wasn't necessarily a success or a failure when it came to how it performed in the market. Back in 2017, I reviewed Sonic Colors with Alec of the SQG Review Show, and we still stand by our review. We perceived Colors to be a solid experience that was hindered by a few fundamental problems. Sonic Forces would then go on to carry the gameplay and level design of Sonic Colors, but the game that truly follows up on the vision behind Colors is none other than Sonic Lost World. Rather than taking the worst parts of Colors and turning it into the full experience, Lost World stands as the logical extension of what producer Takashi Iizuka sought to achieve with Sonic the Hedgehog in Colors. Did Lost World's design approach work in the end? Another discussion to be continued. And with that, I've just presented you a teaser for some of the topics we're going to explore along the way. We're about to dive into what is largely considered a haphazard experience. A really enjoyable kind of haphazard experience. Everything about this opening is perfect until the Lost Hex appears and Tails reveals that he's familiar with this location, but doesn't share the details with Sonic or the player. I understand the importance of withholding this in order to preserve the pacing of the introduction scene, which is why I believe a segment of exposition should have been established after the player completes the first level. Tails could share the information he has gathered about the Lost Hex, and Sonic can react to it, all the while Tails works on repairing the tornado. Putting the newfound setting for this adventure aside, let's reflect on what we just viewed. The encounter between Sonic and Eggman is quite basic by standards set by previous 3D Sonic games, but the animation, music, and overall direction of the cinematic is truly wonderful. Of course, there are a myriad of contextual problems with the Lost Hex right out of the gate, and we should talk about it. Right away, too. The Sonic series is rather consistent when it comes to elaborating on a unique setting. It's what sets many of the entries apart from one another and also makes the world building so worthwhile. From the outset, Sonic Lost World lacks this key priority despite presenting an entirely new setting. The player is never informed as to the true nature of the Lost Hex, aside from a few basic details that mostly serve to give the Zeddy a stage to perform on and do little to serve the area itself. I say area because the writers don't reveal whether the Lost Hex is a planetoid akin to Planet Wisp from Sonic Colors, or something of a floating construct akin to Babylon Garden from the Sonic Riders games. There's a slew of narrative issues and contextual issues with Sonic Lost World right out of the gate, and it's best revealed when comparing the Lost Hex to Little Planet from Sonic CD. It's easiest to look towards Little Planet when trying to understand the rationale behind the Lost Hex, as both act as floating spherical masses from the outside. They have different regions and continents like a typical planet, but it's considerably smaller like a planetoid, and both actually enter the atmosphere of Earth in their respective games. Don't think too hard about that one. Little Planet had the same basic concept from the beginning, yet provides intrigue and mystery. Time travel is essential to the impressions of players as they run through Little Planet's various locations, which encourages observation among the natural and mechanical changes made to the environment. Even if we take time travel out of the picture, we're still left with fantastical and abstract looking environments that give Little Planet something of its own identity. There's something to be said about the life existing there, and it effectively made Dr. Robotnik's insistence on mechanizing the landscapes a truly sickening concept. Another hallmark of Little Planet itself is the connective tissue that ties all of Sonic CD's zones together. Zones are linked by similarities to one another, and the entire planet can be seen within the game itself as well. If I've dug up anybody's fond memories for Sonic CD, it's because the game's unique location is essential to the experience, and something truly worth thinking about. Contrast that with the seemingly similar Lost Hex, and you'll find a completely uninteresting amalgamation of New Super Mario Bros. Worlds that hardly connect and hardly have anything interesting to show in regards to cultures, animal species, or nature. I'm opening this review by highlighting how uninteresting the thematics of Sonic Lost World are to display what this game is going to have to justify and possibly struggle against for its entire runtime. Not for the purpose of putting the game or the developers into a tough spot, but to show that a lack of strong contextualization in Sonic is disappointing, and you'll know it once it's gone. With that said, contextualization is just one thing that can make a game great.
Take it easy there.
Oh, stay calm, little guy. Sonic and Tails will get your buddies back.
Knuckles and Amy have been established as members of the central cast, but are often pushed aside in the modern titles for a stronger focus on Sonic himself. With this in mind, they still play a role in Lost World's story. Contrasting the bizarre landscapes of Windy Hill Zone 1, the first level of the game, the characters occupy a simple field on Earth. Lost World's abstract art style seems to have affected the design of the trees on Earth. Putting that aside, we're still looking at a relatively simplified landscape. Knuckles and Amy never leave this field of grass during any point of the game's story, which sounds horrendously uninspired. Thankfully, there's enough reason for this, as they act as Sonic's connection to a more normalized world from the one he explores during his venture. There's just one problem. The writers didn't do anything with the contrast created. This has no bearing on the experience aside from heightening the sense of bizarre landscapes featured in levels. Label this as a sign of what's to come. I haven't had the right opportunity to review Sonic Unleashed, so let me quickly acknowledge the Miles Electric, a pretty nifty device that allows Tails to accomplish navigational and informational tasks. Giving the Miles Electric an ability to video chat across long distances is a believable and worthwhile addition to the device. It inadvertently explores the creativity behind all of the hard work Tails puts into his technology. I'm not ignorant to the notion that the writers behind this game were lacking in Sonic knowledge and care for continuity. I just think it's worth looking at this from the other side. Knowing that this era of Sonic storylines was lacking in this regard just makes the moments where the characterization from years past is enhanced all the more appealing, even if these elements are accidental. The Miles Electric will be the story's avenue for connecting Sonic back to Earth throughout the game's events, which is promising at the start. I have to say, I really like how these scenes accurately portray the view of both sides of the call, even down to the shaky movements. It's such a small detail, but the attention to detail is evident because of it. Lost World's story follows in the direction writers Ken Pontac and Warren Graff established in Colors and Generations. To put it briefly, we're looking at short, dialogue-heavy cutscenes with minimal overarching runtimes. It's very important that no time during these cutscenes is wasted. This is why I enjoy this moment right here. Amy comforts the animals as they worry about what happened to the rest of them. It's an indirect way of continuing plot from the opening cinematic, wherein Dr. Eggman fled to the skies with several of the animal friends in captivity. All of this occurs in the span of about 4 seconds. It's incredibly efficient, and if the writers were able to maintain the sense of pacing throughout the entire story, we would still end up with a brief one, but one with purpose behind everything being said and shown. For the most part, the writers actually succeeded in this regard. I would go as far to say that Lost World's efficient dialogue writing is the best aspect about the entire story in execution. Another example of this is in the scene when Tails works on repairing the tornado in Windy Hill. Sonic is ready for air travel and asks Tails if he's finished the repairs, and this is what Tails replies with.
I've built a TV out of paper clips.
Yeah.
And reprogrammed a supercomputer using dishwashing detergent and a toothpick.
I know.
So look, fixing a propeller on a biplane? That's about as difficult as taking a nap.
Once again, it only takes a few seconds to delineate the fact that Sonic and Tails aren't on the same page. Tails' monologue is also worth highlighting specifically, because it highlights both the commendable effort on behalf of Pontac and Graf to give their interactions of these characters something to get to grips with, but also the lackluster handling of continuity with past titles. Nothing about Lost World would warrant a story arc involving Sonic and Tails having their friendship tested on the face of it, and there have been countless stories from past games where the two overcame difficult situations together. Still, that's exactly what's being established here. Sonic is rather disinterested in hearing Tails' defense of his own abilities, and the little monologue here is a nice way of communicating his ingenuity to the player along with the Miles Electric upgrade. I'm confident that reprogramming a computer with dishwashing detergent and a toothpick is literally impossible, and it's all written too much like a joke for children, but it does communicate something effectively enough, and that something is important for Tails' character in the story. What's perhaps most significant about this scene is that it establishes Tails' competence as a plot point that will receive development, but let's return to the scene with Sonic's other friends. Characterization deserves special attention here with this introduction to Knuckles and Amy. Knuckles is treated as the punching bag of the three, even being bombarded by the animal friends, though in a playful manner. Sonic reports back that he managed to rescue the animals trapped in the container from the opening, which I suppose is believable enough. And Knuckles simultaneously scolds him for accomplishing so little while boasting about his own abilities. Again, it's efficient writing, although it seems like quite the underwhelming way to represent a character who's known for being much more than this. Amy pushes him aside and feels sympathetic towards the greater situation. This is all well and good, but we're lacking a certain aura with the character. Amy is easily the most affected by the game's more serious events, as we'll see later in an admittingly great scene for her, but it would be hard to argue that most of her screen time isn't some form of a worrying remark about Eggman's schemes. This is the ultimate downfall of Pontac and Graf's get-in and get-out pacing, especially since Lost World's story is the first of their Sonic plotlines to truly attempt to accomplish something narratively beyond some silly jokes and a slightly serious finale. There's no room for Amy to express herself in ways appropriate to past characterization to begin with, and Knuckles is even less impressive. I realize this is just one scene, but I speak for the entire story when I highlight that Knuckles and Amy are simultaneously excellent additions to the story who act on brand enough, but are also incredibly restricted in characterization because of the minimal amount of cutscene time. However, even with this approach in mind, I still fail to see a reason for why Knuckles and Amy could not have acted like they did in the hands of former writers. Their quirks would not contradict their purpose for being in Lost World's story. Saying that Pontac and Graf's Sonic stories contradict characterization of previous titles is something of a given here, so I will be largely analyzing the story for how it stands on its own, but there will be some exceptions depending on whether or not I feel it's noteworthy enough to mention, like the critiques you've already heard. I realize Pontac and Graf have had a difficult time in the face of Sonic fans for years, and with blame on myself included, but I have to be honest about seeing this flaw of the story as a sign that characterization and continuity were not concerns for them, and most notably, to a detrimental effect. Many of Lost World's story beats are delivered through glimpses into the operations at Eggman's secret base. His empty base? No, there are animals being placed in robots, and capsules, and machines, and technology. Well, it certainly looks empty. It's a black void with a white tile floor. I understand what they were going for, but by the time the veil behind Eggman's base has been shattered with the arrival of Sonic and Tails, the lights could have come on and we could have seen more of Eggman's personality in the design. Hardly an issue, just something to note. I suppose the Deadly Six would suspect Eggman was there if something about the base had changed, and maybe this could cause a problem later on. Anyways, the spotlight is initially placed on the woodland critters being inserted into the iconic badniks from Sonic's earlier years. A nice way to illustrate what has been the bread and butter of Eggman's schemes since the very beginning. Eggman is rather cartoonish with his confidence here, but it actually works to highlight how he's been a bit unpredictable in the way he handles himself. What I really like is this shot. The view pans up as we see an imposing character tower over the camera. Zavok is the leader of the Deadly Six, a tribe of Zeti who live on the Lost Hex and have become enslaved by Dr. Eggman to do his bidding. While the air of mispotential will always follow him, Zavok is a rather solid character, and he does make a great first impression.
You are quite the mighty conqueror.
Yes, I am.
Clearly, these two are on shaky terms, but Zavok is planning something without Dr. Eggman's knowledge anyways. The brevity in dialogue was something of a point of praise with prior scenes, but something as detailed as the villain's ultimate goals and aspirations needs more time in the spotlight than what limited cutscene runtimes are going to allow for. This is why Eggman's goals are spliced up and delivered in pieces across the first third of the game's story. This is to say that Eggman's greater scheme in Lost World is revealed in various stages, but the overall goal is somewhat muddy anyways. He claims that he wants to conquer Earth by building an army of badniks on the Lost Hex, while also using Zavok and his Zeti allies to fight and kill Sonic. The grandest part of the whole affair isn't revealed yet, but I already feel mixed reactions to this. As for why Dr. Eggman builds his army of robots on the Lost Hex, I suppose it's to be in hiding. Missing details are constantly a form of irritation throughout the story's short runtime, but by far the most egregious missing information pertains to Dr. Eggman's knowledge of the Lost Hex. Some of his dialogue reveals knowledge about the potential of the Zeti, but he never discusses the environment itself. If I'm correct, then he doesn't actually gain anything from the Lost Hex itself aside from enslaving the Zeti in their natural environment. This may be jumping ahead a bit, but there's nothing stopping the Doctor from draining Earth's energy from another planetoid or floating base akin to the Egg Carrier. All we truly needed was a proper explanation for why Dr. Eggman sought to set up his operations on the Lost Hex. And while the story gives a few possible clues as to why this may be, the cutscenes do little to highlight this or take advantage of the bizarre structures and atmosphere. Any of these explanations could have sufficed, and this is just the minimum bar they had to reach when giving context for Eggman's involvement this time around. On the other hand, I'll still critique the story for what it cares to tell. Let's begin to discuss the Deadly Six and their purpose in the story. Pontac and Graf aim to provide bountiful supplies of comedic material for Sonic to go off of with the Deadly Six. A crazed and psychotic weirdo, a fat and rather daft idiot, a wise yet ignorant elder, a self-obsessed beauty queen, a depressed cynic, and the ruthless power-quenching leader. They all exist in the final product as basic stereotypes, but I don't believe it had to be this underwhelming in the final cut. And really, there's actually quite a bit to like about how these characters are implemented, if I'm honest. The first member of the Koopaling Club is Zaz, whose personality lacks any similarity to that of the leader, but Zavok openly acknowledges that Zaz's one-track mind is perfect for the goal of defeating Sonic. One problem often found with a cliché team of bad guys is a lack of believable chemistry. Lost World handwaves this issue by openly establishing that they don't work well together, but have to regardless. This is made clear as the game progresses. Every time the player completes a couple levels, they'll be treated to another cutscene, and these are often glimpses at the upcoming threat. A new member of the Zeti focusing their attention on Sonic. Of course, these scenes play out after Eggman confronts the protagonist with his powerful allies. Sonic doesn't take it seriously one bit and immediately mocks Zaz for his over-the-top threats and body odor. I don't prefer when Sonic games are animated as stiff as this, but I do like the sort of snarky movement they give Sonic here. The Deadly Six have intimidating and foreign designs, making their overall character design choices a success in my book. So it is actually somewhat refreshing to see Sonic completely unfazed. I mentioned that Sonic doesn't take the reveal of the Zeti seriously at all, but somebody here is definitely taking things seriously. And that's Dr. Eggman.
They are the Deadly Six, and they are your worst enemies.
Lost World has become somewhat infamous for written dialogue that reflects harsh tones and cruel language. Dr. Eggman is at the forefront of this writing choice.
I'm gonna mess you up! I'd love to stay and watch him disassemble you, but I have business to attend to.
I rather like this color on Pontac and Graf's Eggman. It grants him a level of presence and control over the conversation without diminishing the cartoonish sense of villainy that clouds him. To say that Lost World's story achieves the ultimate balance of the two would be overstepping, but Eggman's characterization is consistently compelling and entertaining in Lost World, and I'll continue to build on this as the story goes forward. The developers took advantage of the Deadly Six concept when it comes to implementing their presence beyond cutscenes. Zaz can be heard talking about his desire to take Sonic down as the player begins to make progress through Windy Hill Zone 2 and Zone 4. This is where we can see he's become truly unhinged, and the short dialogue given before each Deadly Six fight helps them shine a bit more too. The subtle choice of giving their speeches a reverb effect during level traversal helps communicate the idea that they are far away, but close enough to build anticipation. However, this is simultaneously the best and worst way the game uses these characters in gameplay. On one hand, their monologues help give some punch to them, namely with informing the player as to how each member feels about their shared responsibility, distinguishing them from one another. Here are a few examples.
Oh, that rotten Sonic! I better take this hedgehog down, or the gang will razz me till I'm blue!
I believe you youngsters refer to a beating as, being schooled? In that case, class is in session.
Smiling hurts my face. When I hurt your face, it'll make me smile. So in the end, I'll just be hurting myself. Cool.
I like what these add to the atmosphere and tone. I really do. On the other hand though, one Zeddy alone is not nearly enough to be interesting. They were designed as foils for each other and fodder for Sonic to laugh at, for better or worse, so isolating them helps highlight how vapid they are as characters just as much as it elevates their singular importance. I hope you can see why I'm mixed about the implementation of the Deadly Six during gameplay, but the only thing needed to solve all of this is to give the Deadly Six members more depth to their personality. So that's an overview of Zaz and the monologue concept, but after his defeat, Dr. Eggman turns to Zomom.
You, fat one!
The notion that each member of the Deadly Six is equally vapid as the next is something I can understand, but cannot agree with. In fact, I'd say there are two tiers to the quality of these villains. There's the straightforward comedic stereotype that doesn't provide much for Sonic or Eggman to bounce off of, and then there's the type that lends itself towards comedic riffing better. Zaz and Zomom are in the former category. They don't provide much to work with and don't promote any laughter from the player, which makes their stereotypical traits of crazy and fat come off as very immature or childish. Zomom in particular wasn't a great idea, and I don't say that because I think becoming heavy from eating lots of food is too offensive a topic to be comedic. It's because Sonic as a character has nothing to relate to or oppose. If Sonic the Hedgehog was a CrossFit advocate or an equally slow couch potato, then it would be a very different story, but he's neither of those things. Sure, he does poke at Zomom by suggesting diet and exercise as an alternate to what he was just doing, but Sonic doesn't have the authority to say this, which makes him come off as a bit of an asshole. I don't often call people by such harsh words, but Sonic's characterization often goes too far in Lost World, and this is one of those cases. Back to Zomom, when the character designers got Zomom approved and his character was finished, I imagine Pontac and Graf looked at him and thought it was a strange choice. That's why the scene dedicated to having Sonic and Zomom interact involves the hedgehog being slapped by a massive sandwich. What else were we supposed to see? A waste of a cutscene and an unfunny joke is all we had to witness, so I hope I've made my point clear. The Deadly Six can all exist as flat and uninspired characters, yet still vary in terms of effectiveness. It's all reliant on how the main cast can play off of them. I know what you might be thinking. Dr. Eggman has been defined by his weight since day one thanks to the egg shape he embodies, and you'd be right. The problem is that the extent of the joke is already used to the fullest in the character's introduction, and in combination with the efficient writing of dialogue, the writers hit the bottom of the well within the first 5 seconds of the new character speaking. It was in the clip I played a couple moments ago. Zomom judged Dr. Eggman for calling him the fat one because Eggman is somewhat fat himself. This is why even the simplest stories are actually very complicated in design, because writing is hard. I'm not projecting, I swear. One of the best aspects about the Deadly Six is that they not only provide a stipend's worth of traits for Sonic to mock, but they also provide Dr. Eggman with the same luxury. The difference lies in Eggman's constant state of having to convince the Zeddy to listen to them, and in this situation, he literally bribes Zomom with more food. Don't get me wrong, it's as cruel as it is humorous, but that's exactly what makes the dynamic interesting. He knows that he can gain control of Zomom because he understands how to take advantage of somebody with low intelligence and a craving for a specific reward. Without question, Dr. Eggman is using all sorts of tactics in order to keep his slaves. Combine this with the harsh words towards his allies and foes this time around, and you have a strongly written villain for the narrative. The best example of this side of the Doctor is seen before the player runs through Desert Ruin Zone 1. This cutscene is one of the best in the entire game, as all of the positive aspects of the story's presentation come together. I'd like for you to think about the following things as you watch this scene: the dialogue, cinematography, and characterization.
These animals are quite underwhelming. I'm disappointed in you incompetent fools. Violently disappointed.
We don't care about your disappointment, Master.
Do you care now? Next time, bring better animals.
On all fronts, this cutscene delivers. Mike Pollock was given excellent direction. He consistently provides a menacing presence, which I believe lands because he's speaking more softly than usual. The English script is really sharp here, and again, the word choice is downright pervasive. The situation is heightened with the low-angle shots, giving Eggman the ability to command his presence. I think the best touch here, or you could say the best example of this scene's direction, is how Eggman waves the cacophonic conch around tauntingly towards the Zeddy. This is the official unveiling of the conch, and it remains one of the best uses in Lost World and its lore, even though it is literally kicked out of the story shortly after this. It's a mystical device that appears to have some history behind it, but most of all, the cacophonic conch is directly connected to the Zeddy. When blown into, it creates a low frequency that inflicts pain on the Zeddy while also inhibiting them from using their powers to manipulate magnetic fields. The origins of the conch are never explored, but it's implied that there is more than one of its kind on the Lost Hex. Given the diabolical use of this device in the cutscene, there are implications that these conches exist as a countermeasure against the Zeddy altogether, and that other intelligent beings may have attempted to control and enslave Zeddy in the past, just as Dr. Eggman is in the present. This is awfully compelling given the limited use of Lost World setting, and I am awarding the story some credit for it. The next member of the Deadly Six is Master Zeke. Alas, a member of the Deadly Six that actually acts as a proper foil to Sonic. Zeke truly is one of the more effective Zeddy in the story, and he enters the cinematics with a decent showing.
It would seem the peaceful days of tending my garden will have to wait. While I take care of these matters, the rest of you cannot.
Please, Master Zik. This is not something you should trouble yourself with. It's beneath you.
Now, don't be concerned.
Zeke's assertion that the Deadly Six have been inept in their ability to take care of Sonic has direct impact on Zavok, placing him in a more defeated state, but I also wish to highlight that he shows his tendencies to override his fellow Zeddy. Zeke considers himself more knowledgeable than his comrades, but also more reliable. Upon the first defeat, he comes back to the base and treats it as if it was only a test of what Sonic is capable of. This contradicts Zeke's own ego, so he actually commits an act of cowardice, throwing his cane directly at Sonic as a surprise attack. My interpretation of this is just that. An old, experienced fellow who's playing dirty despite acting as if he's the noble one of the Zeddy. The reason these cutscenes work decently enough is because Zeke's old school thinking and methodology directly contrasts Sonic, who is consistently living by his own feelings and acting on unique principles from the rest of the cast. And so, I find these short scenes pretty effective, and I'm glad Master Zeke is an example of how the Deadly Six can be utilized well. However, there is a missed opportunity here. I would liken that Dr. Eggman and Zeke would have some interesting chemistry given their claims to authority, and Zavok clearly sees himself beneath Zeke on the surface of it too. I suppose that's the utilization of Deadly Six paying the price for Eggman's separation from them, which is a plot point we have yet to cover. In fact, Xena suffers from the same lack of utilization based on her placement in the plot. Xena is not very effective in the story, as her characteristics are detached from everything else. However, there's a pretty good interaction between her and Zavok.
What if I told you that you were the only one I trusted to be fast enough, smart enough, and pretty enough to beat the blue nuisance?
Well, I'd say you got the right girl for the job.
Well, that was so easy I almost feel guilty.
Efficient. And I have to admit that I find the cutscene where Sonic mocks Xena pretty enjoyable as well, but it's honestly quite a miss. It's reminiscent of the sandwich bit with Zomom. Sonic comes off as a complete jerk to Xena by mocking her tone and insulting her, and while it was probably based on truth, it oversteps the idea of the Deadly Six giving Sonic material, because it becomes an issue where Sonic himself is losing likability for the viewer. I also believe that if we are to stick to the stereotypical ideas, the nails bit should not have gotten a second swing. Xena is overly focused on her nails for 2 scenes in a row, and if it was lackluster the first time, it's going to be doubly so the second time. The English voice acting for the Deadly Six members is consistently well performed, unlike some of the other voice actors, and I think this allows me to enjoy some of their weaker scenes more than I probably should. Perhaps this applies to Xena's scenes because they really don't offer much comedic or thought-provoking at all. Thanks to some sharp dialogue and a solid voice acting performance, I'll gladly take Xena over Zaz, but she's wholly ineffective. Thankfully, the next member of the Deadly Six is mostly a success in my eyes, that being Zor. Lost World's sharp and pointed writing style for many of the game's characters is an interesting addition to Pontac and Graff's writings for Sonic, and Zor is the definitive example of this. His musings are long-winded and signifying of a totally depressed attitude, which is, yes, exactly the opposite of our main hedgehog. I'll get the negatives out of the way now. Xena's situation is shared with Zor, which means that he's not given the opportunity to properly engage with Sonic thanks to the overarching narrative during their time to shine. But the air of disappointment worsens when I consider just how excellent of a combination Sonic and Zor are. At this point in the story, Tails has been kidnapped and Sonic's overall attitude has changed to one of concern and frustration. Therefore, Sonic isn't opposing Zor's mentality as much as he normally would, and thus we can see the story was not planned out very well. But all of that aside, Zor is a character I find genuinely interesting thanks to his nihilistic thoughts. It's not detailed, but it's also not something we've seen in the series before. At the very least, I can contrast Zor's outlook on life with Sonic's typical attitude, even if the story drops the ball here thanks to the placement of Zor in the plot. While I stand by the belief that Zaz, Zomom, and Xena aren't very compatible with Sonic or Eggman as comedic foils, there's a reason they are the way that they are. In fact, understanding this helps the Deadly Six's situation a lot. So what exactly am I hinting at? The Deadly Six, with the addition of Dr. Eggman, represent the 7 deadly sins, sometimes called the cardinal sins. For those who are unaware, this concept is a hallmark of Christian teachings, particularly utilized by the Catholic Church in order to steer people away from bad tendencies and the like. Out of context, the religious connotation for the Deadly Six may seem like an odd addition to the Sonic the Hedgehog series, but I give the story planning department a lot of credit here. If you're gonna have a cliche Koopaling-esque group of bad guys, it would be appreciated if they represented an iconic idea, each of them individually representing something, but also holistically. And yes, I'd say that Sonic Team accomplishes this. This is the source of the Deadly Six's stereotypical personalities, so we can call this design idea a blessing and a curse. I rather like this idea though, even if it once again places characters like Zomom in a tough spot. Maybe it doesn't help that Pontac and Graff are focused on humor over commentary, but that's going off track. I researched how the Catholic Church defines these terms, so let's see how the writers did. Zaz represents wrath, which the Catholic Church describes as anger that's become targeted at an innocent person. So unjust and unnecessary vitriol fall into wrath as well. I'd say this checks out. In fact, what I find so annoying about Zaz is that he's constantly acting out, even when Sonic's not around. Zomom represents gluttony, and according to Pope Gregory I, this can mean many things. Well, Zomom violates quite a few of these principles, namely taking food with too much eagerness, and exceeding the necessary quantity of food. Even the oversized sandwich checks out. Is it okay that I'm bothered by it anyway? Zeke represents pride, which is defined as neglecting to recognize the value of others and believing oneself to be superior to others. Absolutely. Zeke sees his age as a sign of superior wisdom to the other Zeddy, and to a fault. All true, even though I still find his ignorance pretty humorous. Xena represents lust, which is defined as intense and uncontrolled sexual desire. Well, it's Sonic the Hedgehog, so obviously we aren't seeing any of that here. However, they did get the point across well enough. Here's my favorite example of Xena's dialogue towards Sonic.
Aww, it's cute the way he keeps on trying to get past all the death traps and enemies and stuff. I think he kind of likes me.
She's thinking about Sonic in a romantic way, for whatever reason. Her obsessive focus on looking attractive is an easy connection to draw as well, so I'd say Xena checks out. Let's keep going with Zor, who represents sloth. Sloth is defined by the church as indifference to life and a complete lack of interest in most aspects of life. It's actually an extremely broad category, but I think Zor's apathy captures the essence of the concept incredibly well. Within the Deadly Six itself, we get a glimpse at how Zor isn't particularly liked or appreciated by his colleagues, which is perfect for characterization. However, it's such a small contribution thanks to the incredibly brisk pacing as expected. As for the last two sins, I'll be saving those comments for when they become more relevant. At long last, we can discuss Dr. Eggman's greater scheme in depth. Using the Lost Hex as a base of operations detached from Earth, Dr. Eggman maintains an energy extracting process that harnesses Earth's energy and converts it into a fuel-like substance. The CG depiction of the extraction process is as beautifully rendered as it is devastating to watch. It's not exactly a heart-wrenching depiction, but it certainly is effective at showing what it needs to. The energy extracted is really something else. It seems to give Cubot a high. No, really, it does.
Oh yeah, that's the stuff. Feed me, baby. I'm feeling stronger by the second.
Or maybe that's just Cubot being weird. Either way, it's a fairly shallow idea. The notion of draining energy like sucking air through a vent hardly makes sense in such a metaphysical way. However, Eggman's reaction to Orbot's warning about the instability of the process is pretty significant.
Levels fluctuating, reaction unstable. Better shut it down quick, boss, or it will lock into overload.
Shut it down. Why just stop, boss? I felt great! The machine is unstable. We just want to borrow some of the planet's energy. We don't want to destroy it.
I'm not actually interested in his reasoning. This style of Sonic story isn't going to offer much in that department, but I like the contrast this immediately gives Zavok. There's a reason for him to disagree with Dr. Eggman from an idealistic point of view beyond the cruel enslavement of his kind, which just adds to the rising tension between these two. The turning point for the plot happens here, in a surprisingly well-directed scene no less. The crescendo of tensions between Zavok and Dr. Eggman arrives at a forte of chaos and revolt on behalf of the Zeddy, but it's actually Sonic who makes the great mistake. He took one look at Dr. Eggman's cacophonic conch and concluded it was problematic. It sure was, but all hell breaks loose with Eggman no longer in control.
I think that thing in Eggman's hand
Gone! Eggman's shell is gone.
That was a mistake.
Whatever.
The scene is presented in a way that makes Sonic seem brash and irresponsible, but the story simply introduces that perspective here. The bulk of this moment, this turning point, is witnessing the devastation an uncontrolled clan of Zeddys can bring to Sonic, Tails, and especially Dr. Eggman. The line between comedy and drama is probably at its peak in this scene as well. An action set piece makes up the latter half of the scene, and it's legitimately engaging, thanks to some creative camera work, but also the animation work. The impact of every collision is felt strongly, and I love the use of dynamic timing to camera cuts. I know it sounds like a super specific thing to praise the cinematography so specifically, but I truly believe this cutscene is the best directed and best executed in the entire game. It's all thanks to these choices. Tails' characterization is somewhat tarnished by his tendency to be hiding during most of the scene, but having Sonic carrying him out of the area does lend a sense of urgency. Eggman's running animation is simply a beauty. Despite the story's minimal scope, there were a number of plot beats building up to this scene, and I feel that the writers successfully created a tense, dramatic, and significant cutscene that pays forward what's to come. But that's just the question. With the Deadly Six now of free will, what's next for Sonic, Tails, and Eggman? The majority of the story involves an alliance between Sonic, Tails, and Eggman, featuring all of the ups and downs that result from that group dynamic. Unfortunately, the plot beats that connect this arc together are incredibly flimsy despite some good moments, but the introduction of the idea is fine enough. Eggman explains himself very clearly to Sonic. The conch was the only method to restrain the powers and sensibilities of the Zeddy, and with Sonic's brash decision, he's completely powerless. The stakes have lowered tremendously as we get to see Eggman merely upset with his arch nemesis and nothing more. Aside from his robot assistants, he has essentially nothing. That is, except for the generator at the top of Lava Mountain. From this point on, the story goes through a rigid routine. Sonic, Tails, and Eggman travel zone by zone until they reach the generator and shut it down, while Sonic deals with the remaining members of the Deadly Six along the way. Story-wise, this is even less to work with than what the writers had previously, and I can't help but be disappointed given the greater narratives written for previous games. The jokes get seriously out of hand at times, and don't help with Sonic's characterization one bit. As you can tell from the subtitles alone, Sonic is handling the truce with Eggman very immaturely, a kind of annoying deflection that lasts for far too much of the adventure. I simply don't understand why this was necessary. There were far better ways to have Sonic and Eggman argue. Sonic has often been honest to a fault, a kind of blunt honesty that's gotten him in trouble with those who have power over him in the past. While it would be silly to say Sonic can never do wrong and therefore his characterization in the story is flawed, he really seems clueless as to how his actions involving the Deadly Six were seriously flawed until the big argument that happens later. This blunder makes it difficult to tolerate Sonic during the middle of the story, but it is somewhat helped by the fact that the writers use Dr. Eggman's rational approach as a way to humanize him further. Still, it's worth stressing how annoying Sonic can be in this story. The idea that Sonic and Eggman would reluctantly work together is a really solid one for the story to associate itself with, but the writing has finally gone too sharp for its own good. It becomes genuinely annoying to hear Roger Craig Smith constantly whine in front of the other two, and that is not a criticism against Smith at all. I don't think anybody would have been able to pull off these lines well. It's simply overbearing and undesirable for the character outright. In Tropical Coast, Eggman tries to explain the situation regarding the generator to Sonic and Tails.
It was supposed to extract energy from our world, but the machine is unstable. Once it reaches full power, it can't be shut off. It will drain our world dry.
Oh, so that's what Amy was talking about.
And you just want to go smash it, don't you?
Well, yeah. What? It's what I do!
But that's not what you do. Even if you put aside the writers not understanding their source material well, they've built Sonic's massive mistake based on something not believable. I praise that cutscene for being incredibly well executed, but this decision to have Sonic notice Eggman controlling the Zeti and then deciding to destroy his hold on them was clearly misguided for the character. It's funny because I actually think it could have worked if another direction was taken. If an emphasis was placed on the slavery Dr. Eggman was invoking, it would make a lot of sense for Sonic to break them free of his grasp on that principle alone. Perhaps that is what they were going for? Maybe that was Sonic's rationale, but the hedgehog had seen what the Deadly Six were capable of well before that confrontation, not to mention he had reason to think the Zeti weren't on good terms with the Doctor. Please don't mistake me, Dr. Eggman's actions are wholly reprehensible. I'm just not convinced Sonic would have made this decision based on the information he had. This is what the built-up disdain between these two characters is built on. Very well. As established near the start of this review, Sonic and Tails have had some subtle disagreements that were going to lead into a larger conflict for the two, and logically, we see them more disagreeable here. Tails believes he has the moral high ground, because it's easy for him to feel that way, given he's been largely inactive after the opening. And then there's Sonic, who seems to be spouting microaggressions without really caring. I actually believe the tension between these friends is built up pretty well, even as the plot begins to strain. However, the disagreement between these friends clashes when Tails forcibly interjects himself into Sonic's quarrels with Eggman. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the tensions between Sonic, Tails, and Eggman come to their breaking point once they've reclaimed the secret base. The narrative is trying to use the crossing of tensions to create a sense of frustration among the cast. The breaking point, if you will.
Thanks for fixing me!
No problem. Sorry you got stuck with a voice chip that looks like it was built by a 2-year-old.
I think I liked it better when I was trying to destroy you.
Yeah, well, feelings mutual, egg face.
Whoa! Before we start destroying each other, let's remember why we're working together.
Okay, please remind me.
Tails, we need Eggman to shut down his machine.
And you don't trust me to do it.
What? No! I trust you, Tails. It's just that...
No, you don't. You trust Eggman more. Do you know how much that bites?
I do trust you, Tails, but the whole world's in danger because I did something stupid. Do you know how much that bites?
At this point, Sonic has witnessed the state of the world and has genuine concern over the well-being of his friends back home, so it is nice to see him trying to mediate here and get everyone back on track. I don't feel that the mishandling of Sonic's characterization in previous scenes takes away from his shift in attitude here. It's all justified and it serves as a nice counterweight to Tails, who we could argue had the upper hand in the ongoing dispute up until this point. The major issue with this moment of the narrative is that Tails reacts unrealistically defensive that Sonic is enlisting Eggman's help. The work done in previous scenes was enough for this argument to happen, but it didn't happen very naturally at the most crucial point. Tails goes from 3 drastically varied emotions in this one scene, and with no proper character work done, he ends up coming off as manic, and the story really suffers because there's no consistency with the arc. Sonic tries to explain himself to Tails, and from the audience perspective, he's clearly in the right this time. Tails doesn't accept it at all, and the scene loses focus fast. I believe this scene needed a rewrite. It's on target with the narrative's plot points and characterization that led us here, but the execution is sloppy and rushed. Once again, I find myself wondering if the story that the writers were aiming to tell was never truly suited to this short and snappy cutscene style. Thankfully, there's a really great scene with some effective character work to analyze. Zavok and Zaz taunt the main cast through a projection and really get under their skin. The sharp dialogue and mockery on behalf of Zavok and Zaz meets a very harsh end. Dr. Eggman really shines in this scene. It's one of my favorite scenes with him in the entire series. It's not good because it's dark, it's good because of how well directed it is. Several things had to come together to make this character moment work, and this scene highlights the strengths of Lost World's story underneath its flaws.
I'll get fat from eating your black hearts, you Eggman wannabes!
Whoa!
Sonic and Tails are taken aback by how angry the Doctor is, and it's a striking contrast to how powerful and in control the mad scientist felt earlier on. He was a master at keeping the Deadly Six at bay, almost toying with them. He was demeaning and a savage, waving the conch around and wielding his power. But now, we've had time to sit with an upset villain who's been drained by having to work with his annoying adversaries. All of this only to be mocked by the very creatures he sought to control, with the leader bragging about how great hijacking the energy draining machine is working out for them. It's believable that Dr. Eggman would unleash his darker side here, though I admit that the condensed nature of the cutscenes in the game could make it feel a little jarring. But within this format, I really love what happens here.
Where are you gonna live when your world's dead, guys? Oh, right, you've been dead too. Too bad for you.
I will burn your worlds, you rebellious scum! I will destroy everything you love and make you rot! No!
Boss, your hands!
As long as I can still strangle a Zeti, my hands are fine.
That last line is especially iconic to me. The camera work is still simplistic, but it's given some movement, and weight is provided to Eggman's words by the way in which it frames his demeanor in an almost unsettling way. And how could I forget Mike Pollock's stern delivery? It's bold without going over the top, and he successfully creates this feeling that the Doctor is having conflict controlling his emotions. This is great. And at this point, only a few scenes where focus is placed on Sonic, Tails, and Eggman working together remain to be analyzed. Perhaps one of the most jarring and rushed scenes of character work involves Dr. Eggman saving Tails from being attacked by a crab badnik? Well, I think it's nice that Sonic and Eggman have this debate over whether or not the nuclear approach to taking out the Zeti is a good idea. I could do with a lot more detail from Eggman as to how he plans to accomplish this, but this idea works in principle. It's a conversation quickly interrupted by cheesy drama with the mentioned attack, and while Cubot is there to make things somewhat light, Sonic takes the incident extremely seriously to a ridiculous degree. Even go as far in the English localization to say that Tails could have gotten himself killed just now. No amount of excuse for mischaracterization is going to hide the fact that this is a difficult assertion, and I don't think it warrants any further explanation. I do enjoy this little exchange between the three, however.
Not the best idea to put the dimwit's head on a battle bot.
In hindsight, I gotta agree with you, Doc. Thanks for the save. Can you get off me now?
I can't figure you out. 1 second you're contemplating genocide, and the next you're saving one of your worst enemies.
I'm a complicated guy.
In Silent Forest, Tails conducts a reading on the animal capsule, and it's quite the suspicious reading at that. So despite recognizing his mistake earlier, Sonic decides to rush into this objective without thinking again, only this time it causes Tails to be captured and teleported right to the hands of the Zeti. This is because Zavok gained the idea from Zeke to turn Sonic into a robot using Eggman's machinery. This all feels so horribly arbitrary and contradictory in execution, but Sonic and Eggman mourning Tails' situation comes off as if they're speaking about him at a funeral. No, really, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. Clearly, the voice direction was far too serious for this scene.
Tails acted for the greater good. Let's make sure his sacrifice isn't for nothing.
I'm supposed to be the fastest, but I was too slow to save my buddy.
Do you see how polarizing this story can be? Aside from a couple significant moments later, this is the bulk of the heroes and villains teaming up in this story, and I have to say, the results were very mixed. The writers attempted to add tension and conflict into these pre-existing characters without taking into consideration where said characters have been and who they truly are. But even within the framework of Lost World's plot, some moments come off as sloppy anyways. Still, there's a lot of enticing moments along the way, and a really good effort of giving Dr. Eggman some much needed depth. With Dr. Eggman fully established, the largest threat still remains to be analyzed.
Hello, Sonic.
Yeah, I've been looking for you.
Zavok's manipulation is one of the constants throughout Lost World's story. His motivations have already been addressed, but we haven't really looked at what he has to offer. The leader of the Deadly Six is given the most emotional range, as is evident by his interactions with the rest. I praise Zavok's interactions with Dr. Eggman, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. His design and the actor's performance command a strong and menacing presence, but his demeanor is given a level of contrast by his cohorts, best demonstrated comedically in the scene involving Tails being kidnapped.
And now, Sonic, it's time for...
How come he's not blue?
You incompetent fools! I cannot trust you with the simplest of tasks.
Without carrying the torch of Zeke's ego, Zavok can actually achieve the most out of his clan, and he aims to do so with a firm grasp on who his enemies are. He studied Dr. Eggman's schemes and methods while acting under his lead, and then, as the power dynamic shifts towards his favor, Zavok focuses on how to combat Sonic. One could say that Zavok really comes into his own once the Zeti take control of Eggman's machines, and his motivation for asserting power is simply to obtain more of it by draining the planet of all of its resources. His method of accomplishing this throughout a majority of the story involves manipulating his henchmen into going after Sonic, but he's redeemed by his own personal efforts. Taunting Sonic with the possibility of a roboticized Tails is to prelude the kind of psychological manipulation that the Zeti is actually talented with. Rather than stalling Sonic long enough to drain the world of its energy, he tries to actively break the character down in various stages. But first, the plot point that sets Zavok's power into motion. Once Zavok takes control of the machine and proceeds to drain the world of its life, Sonic and Tails check in with Knuckles and Amy, and they observe the severity of the situation.
Sonic, something bad's happening.
Whoa, what's going on?
I don't know. It's like something in the sky is draining the life out of the world. Plants, animals, even the air feels cold and dead.
Okay, you guys stay safe down there. I'll try to figure out what's going on and stop it.
It's a very successful scene in my eyes, because for once you really feel how separated these characters truly are, and there's an element of total hopelessness as Amy remarks on the changing state of the world. It doesn't come off as overly dramatic, unlike many scenes in the story, yet carries enough weight to have some emotional resonance. All the hallmarks that make Lost World's best scenes so captivating are here, and it's all thanks to the direction. The cinematography, tone, and music all coalesce into providing a low point for the heroes. Later in the story, we're treated to a similar story beat, but Zavok's plan is much farther along, and Sonic comes closer and closer to paying the price for his earlier mistakes.
It's too late for us, Sonic. Save the world and kick some butt for all of us. I'm sorry I never got to say.
Amy! Knuckles!
One by one, your friends are falling. Soon, you will be all alone.
Zavok's psychological efforts begin with this scene, a moment of hostility that begins to crack underneath himself. It really is sort of a turning point for the character, and the taunting finally makes Sonic snap outright. If only the entire game had been built to something of this nature, but the result is still convincing. The key behind Zavok's role in the story is his deadly sin: envy. He represents an intense desire to claim something of another, that being Dr. Eggman. He finds success when acting on his desires, and once he has everything, he uses Sonic's humanity and passions against him. You can achieve quite a lot with this, and I think Lost World makes a fair attempt in these scenes. When everything comes together for Zavok, he's the greatest threat in the narrative. About those sins, there's still one left, isn't there? During the climax of the story in Lava Mountain, operations to transform Tails into a robot take center stage. It's honestly one of the better scenes in the game thanks to spending enough time on each aspect it wishes to present. It's kind of fun to see Zavok hamming it up now that he thinks he's got an ace in the hole, but Tails gets creative and there's some real payoff for his ingenuity that was established early on. Of course, the story can't seem to successfully do one thing without compromising another plot point, because Tails' brightest moment in the plot is extremely underwhelming. After all the conflict involving what he is and isn't capable of, he pretends to be the robot slave Zavok was so excited about, only to reveal he manipulated his way out of their scheme and gives the Zeddy a surprise attack. A very underwhelming moment of rebellion. What you see is what you get. I wish the writers took this much further. It would be nice to see the level of action and spectacle from the Desert Ruins scene reinstated here. Imagine seeing Tails actually battle with the Zeddy and severely injure them using the weapon they try to impose on him for their gain. It would be rather satisfying, but more importantly, would help prove to Sonic that Tails really was underestimated. Here, it doesn't really come off as strongly as it should, and I can't help but be a little disappointed. Before Tails is given his final moment of development, Dr. Eggman's allegiance is given the spotlight again. Only this time, it's the best setup yet. I know, I'm very hot and cold when it comes to this story.
Wow, it's quite a drop.
Yes, yes it is.
Oh! You guys are going down! This energy machine is made us way stronger!
Eggman!
Surely the Doctor didn't actually die, but I like this moment quite a bit because it forces Sonic to be separated from his arch-nemesis at the 11th hour. The story could really go anywhere from here. There's a myriad of directions you could take with Eggman's character at this point, and the writers were aware of this. Once again, we have a cutscene that is well directed through its tone. It straddles the line between tension without becoming overly cheesy like some of the more infamous scenes, and I think it places Sonic in the right headspace to take on the Deadly Six in the final act. I wish I could extend this to the Zeddy, the characters I spent a long time analyzing in this video, yet the writers seem to give up on them, also at the 11th hour. The main henchman, the leader of the unique villains for this game, Zavok, is unceremoniously defeated during the game's final main stage, and the Deadly Six as a whole are eliminated from any future story scenes. This is often a point of criticism against Lost World's story, and I strongly agree with the case being made. It's so strange to have the characters disappear from the story completely. It doesn't help that their defeat in gameplay is as vague as a poof of clouds or smoke. That's all the player is given. Are they dead? I don't think so. So in the final reveal, it turns out that Dr. Eggman had always planned to betray the heroes and use them in order to get through the Deadly Six, thus reclaiming his technology and resuming his schemes from the very beginning. I really like how this is explained despite the revelation itself being incredibly predictable. And it's actually thanks to this overly telegraphed speech that we finally have the seventh sin revealed. Dr. Eggman represents greed, the idea of favoring material wealth and personal gains above all else. If you ever wondered why Eggman's cruel side is so emphasized in Lost World, this is why. He's earned himself the title of one of the deadly sins, and it was his actions along with how he treated his allies that set him down this path. It all works rather well, despite the cliches surrounding the development of this idea. Regarding the Deadly Sins comparison, I think this little experiment revealed that yes, the Deadly Six and Dr. Eggman reflect the 7 deadly sins very well, and not just in the name of the group. I apologize if this connection was obvious to many of you. I just had a lot of fun looking into it. With these 7 traits, the ultimate springboard for the main cast is apparent. It might sound cruel to advocate for the fact that the main characters take so much of the runtime to make fun of these new characters, but Lost World gets away with this well enough. I don't mind that Sonic, and to a lesser extent Eggman, take time to mock the Deadly Six characters because they are built on what are considered universally as bad character traits. I could criticize Lost World's story for picking at low-hanging fruit, but note that the goal of the story is extremely innocuous in this entry. So while the character interactions between the characters of new and old can come off as elementary or childish at times, I'm grateful that there's no greater point being made alongside it. This is what I mean when I say that Lost World's story isn't trying and why that can be considered a good thing, when the foundations are not thought out. And that's the core of Sonic Lost World's story. It's written in a way that meanders throughout its smart and silly moments that leaves the player kind of disappointed. But I think Lost World's story can be improved with one or two decisions made. One, make Zavok completely neutral to Sonic, and have scenarios in which he is collaborative with Sonic and dismissive of him. Or have Zavok join Sonic and Tails directly, possibly even leaving other members of the Deadly Six behind. Really, it all kind of falls on this character to hold everything together. When you think about it, Zavok is what links Sonic and Tails' dynamic to Dr. Eggman's greater schemes, along with the greater plan of draining the world's energy. Yet the character himself kind of meanders his way through the story based on what's most convenient, and it doesn't help that he goes unseen during various points of the story as well. You know, I've gone on record saying in the Sonic Colors review that Lost World's story was fantastic, and I included it in a list of Sonic stories that I perceived to be exceptional at the time. Well, my perspective changed as I grew older, and my philosophy changed as a whole. The issues I perceive from this game's story are far more significant to me as the person I am now than who I was then. And with the conclusion of that point, the story bows out with the defeat of Dr. Eggman in some banter-filled scenes. Overall, I still feel that Lost World's story fares better than many exclaim. It's a mess of tonality and quality, but there's enough to latch onto for what is one of the least prominent stories in the series, and so I'd really have a hard time saying it's outright bad. With little emphasis placed on the cutscenes when using the story to gameplay ratio, the extremely apparent lack of cohesion between cutscene environments and gameplay environments, the ways in which the plot never addresses the Lost Hex's creative level structures featured in the gameplay, and the simple beginning and ending scenes, all leading me to wonder, how much was the story really trying to say? Many have given Pontac and Graf too much credit for allegedly attempting to do something significant with Lost World's story, and that they simply failed terribly. While I pointed out where I felt effort was placed into creating a larger narrative with specific details here and there, my interpretation is based on the previously established conclusion. Lost World's story wasn't a focus of the project at all, arguably less integral to the game than the story of Sonic Colors. Now, this does not absolve Lost World's story from criticism. I would hope that my perspective has shown that I see both sides here. I just think it's important to interpret the focus of a game as unusual as this one. They attempted to add some flimsy character arcs onto Sonic, Tails, and Eggman into the Colors stew, and it tasted a bit sour. They incorporated Knuckles and Amy to provide a perspective from Earth, but their presence equated to a pinch of salt. New villains make an appearance, but despite some worthwhile dialogue, they are underbaked and underwhelming. Yet, aside from the occasional moments of baffling writing, Lost World's story isn't nearly as radical as some proclaim. In this case specifically, that's a very good thing. I see the attempts at serious situations and dark character dialogue as trying to spice life into the Saturday morning cartoon affairs of Colors for the sake of pushing the envelope and making the dramatic moments more compelling, while not consistently doing enough to earn these moments. But it's not so concrete this way. There are genuinely many moments that are given time to develop into something meaningful for the characters and plot, and I still enjoy many aspects of the story to this day. The opening cinematic, Eggman's hostile efforts towards the Deadly Six, the chaotic turn of events in the desert, establishment of Zavok's plan to harness the energy, Tails' manipulation and payoff with the competency point, Amy's farewell to Sonic, Zavok getting under Sonic's skin, Eggman faking his own death, and the scene of Sonic calling it a day in the field. Every one of these moments is an absolute joy to witness because they hit home everything they need to within the greater depiction of the story's various themes, even when they suffer from a selection of problems I've been analyzing, whether that be limited runtime, inconsistent characterization, or something else entirely. Some of the cutscenes in this game are great, while more flawed scenes still shine with some really worthwhile dialogue. The best conclusion I can make about the story in Lost World is that it's a mixed bag of ideas, with no clear audience in mind. I still enjoy various aspects of it, but it definitely needed a lot more time in the oven to be truly great. And even then, I'm not sure the writers had a vision for the story that would satisfy the gameplay regardless. But maybe that doesn't matter. Creating a coherent and meaningful story centered around a bizarre location like the Lost Hex must be a real challenge, to be fair. Lost World's story fails to capitalize on the unique setting featured in the game, but nothing truly egregious happens across its half an hour of cutscenes. In fact, the actual events of the story stand as the most emotionally interesting since Sonic and the Black Knight. Is it strange to say that Lost World's story accomplishes more thematically and emotionally than Colors or Generations, yet has the least interesting premise? I'd argue that it really isn't such a wonder when you consider the final product. I certainly like more than I dislike, but I tried to analyze the peaks and troughs of such a strange story with that aside. And that's all I really have to say about the story. Except, the ending cutscene remains. A fleeting story is treated with an emblematic ending, a simple scene involving the restoration of the world and Sonic taking a nap on a grassy field. It's so simplistic, but it works. For once, Sonic places value in the world he fought to restore, appreciating the comfort of having a place wherein he can take a deep breath and relax. It's enough to show the player that our planet offers an experience we often take for granted, comfort and familiarity. But after the insanity of the Lost Hex, the dull fields of grass fulfill its narrative purpose, actually standing for something. I have no qualms with folks saying that this field is an uninspired setting, but it truly works during the final scene with Sonic here. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that, despite the story's significant issues, it ends in a surprisingly great and appropriate way. The gameplay of Sonic Lost World focuses less on story integration than practically any other game in the franchise. What used to be such a holistic approach for the Blue Blur has been traded for something less restrictive in terms of theming, and of course, the kind of platforming gameplay it's going to be presenting. Lost World is divided into 4 stages for each world, each bolstering both 3D and 2D segments, a trend which continues on from Sonic output at the time. Unlike anything seen before, Lost World provides 3 methods of moving forward, each with different speeds and situations in mind. There's a slow jog, running, and spin dashing. Holding down the right trigger allows the player to run, while holding the left trigger activates the spin dash, though if both are held down, the spin dash will override the standard run. All 3 of these methods of movement have their quirks and nuances, but the entire reason behind this was simple: to grant the player complete control over Sonic's speed. Even with the presence of scripted sections, there's an emphasis on control in a way players have never seen before from the series. In execution, the run button feels a bit tacky. There's rarely any moments when jogging is necessary, thanks to how responsive Sonic is this time around. If anything, one of the most controversial decisions isn't the run button, but the decision to have Sonic slow down when he turns sharply in the run state. This was implemented to help players see what is coming ahead when turning on tubular levels. It's a bit odd, and it does feel unnatural at first. In fact, 2D sections cap Sonic's top speed at a lower threshold than the 3D sections for similar reasons. Restrictions are hardly justifiable with 3D Sonic design to me, but I do think the results for this are more favorable than not for Lost World. While it's true that turning sharply while running will result in a lower speed, sensitive tilting of the left analog stick will allow Sonic to turn without losing much speed, and moreover, mid-air momentum is especially useful for both casual and veteran players. Sonic's moveset extends far beyond dashing this time around, with a special return of the bounce move featured in Sonic Adventure 2 and 06. The player can use it to immediately drop down and transition into a spin dash seamlessly, which is very useful for speedrunning. The primary purpose for the move is to break things open below you in a quick fashion, with 3 consecutive bounces launching Sonic higher than before. It's a rather neat change that trades some of the move's speed with added utility, which actually plays quite nicely into Lost World's exploration. A kick attack has been added to vary combat and serves the opposite purpose. The kick attack removes options for Sonic to follow up, but acts as a faster way to defeat certain enemies, notably ones that enter a stunned animation upon being homing attacked. Moreover, the homing attack has also seen its greatest enhancements yet, and it's arguably a little overpowered here. You can now lock onto multiple targets at once, and can also deliver a flurry of rapid homing attacks on several enemies. It has little practical use in shaking up enemy combat, but levels often feature clumps of smaller enemies to encourage you to lock on and attack them all in one go. I actually rather like it simply because it has a satisfying feel to it. The homing attack can also charge itself by waiting to strike an enemy with more defense, noted by the increase in reticles present. This is also somewhat arbitrary, but it is more fun than not to play around with. It's worth mentioning the double jump, but I also have to give praise for copying Mario's system of having 2 buttons act as jump, and here's why. Pressing the B button after jumping will force Sonic to double jump regardless of the homing attack reticle locking on, which means players will never find themselves homing attacking when they intended to jump mid-air. This works as an effortless solution in both 3D and 2D segments, which is great. The player is always in control of whether they double jump or homing attack. But how exactly would you know of such an obscure quality of life change? In fact, how would you learn about most of these things? Well, let's just say conveyance isn't Lost World's strength. In fact, tutorialization is poor overall. Question mark icons return, but many of the descriptors are vague in their language to describe mechanics, at least in the English version. Not only that, but there's no organic form of tutorialization in level design aside from a few instances early on. Sure, rings are used to guide players along certain paths to good effort, but that still doesn't teach new players how to perform moves like wall running. I want to make it clear that I consider Lost World's tutorialization and lack of conveyance a significant problem. Not long from now, I will be analyzing advanced mechanics and hidden moves that really make the experience for me, but I want to make it clear in advance that I do not expect all players to have discovered them, nor does any of my praise excuse poor tutorialization. With that said, this is also about my experience with the game, and the things that I'm passionate about will get pretty specific. Perhaps the most unique mechanic is parkour, and it's something that plays to the strengths of the gameplay more than anything else. By holding down the right trigger against a wall straight on, Sonic can climb up it. This can be enhanced by spin dashing during your ascent to gain even more height before the player can choose to jump off or let Sonic slide down. If you hold down the trigger towards a wall that is applied with any sort of inertia at all, Sonic will run along the wall in a descending arc, which can be extended with a short spin dash. These are the primary forms of parkour, and I have to say, it never gets old. Parkour maneuvers are incredibly satisfying to use, especially in 3D segments. What makes the parkour system truly great is that it provides so many opportunities, both systematically through pathways with walls over hazards, and organically within a linear set piece. You can interact with the level design with total freedom and create your own solutions for how to navigate. Take a level like Tropical Coast Zone 1. The level is relatively flat with a reliance on tubular terrain, but there's a lot of exploring that can be done, such as finding red rings, defeating enemies, and saving animal buddies, which contribute to a total score for unlocking levels. Sometimes you'll find slopes, sometimes you'll find a golden cannon that will take you to an auto run section, or sometimes you'll even find a wisp power-up. You may even find a giant purple robot that you can roll around in. You get the idea. There's a ton of stuff lying around, but it doesn't feel as random as it probably should. Every landmark feels like a logical place for the player to explore along the way, but not necessarily demanding that you explore everything on one playthrough. So that's how the level is designed. You take the parkour mechanics, and then suddenly the player can climb or swerve around whatever they desire. It's not a non-linear gameplay loop, but there is true freedom granted by the parkour system, and commitment to giving the player full control of Sonic's speed goes hand in hand. Even the 2D sections featured throughout the game feature great opportunities for wall jumping that's handled through the parkour system. In moments like these, I feel in control enough to be excited about what I'm accomplishing in the game, but the parkour system is still automated enough to feel easy and reliable. That is, once you know how it works. Sonic Lost World's gameplay not only provides a lot of room for player expression, but the entire game has a great kinetic energy to it. No longer are we boosting at the speed of sound, but the same energy is felt in a micro sense with how well Lost World systems play into one another. See, in Lost World, Sonic can carry momentum in the air after initiating running or spin dashing. As long as you commit to one of those methods of movement, Sonic will carry himself and be eligible for parkour that keeps speed in the player's hands. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Again, one of the best decisions made with the moveset is the return of the double jump from Sonic Colors. It controls much better and strings into Lost World's unique sense of momentum very well. Yet it's very clear that the basics of movement and gaining speed have been simplified with the 3 tiers of movement: jogging, running, and spin dashing. I actually consider it a good thing that momentum based on velocity didn't return for the gameplay system in Lost World, because the adherence to gravity shifting level design would completely destroy any level of flow or freedom that momentum would provide. You'd have to use your imagination for this, but imagine if Sonic used a spin dash or simply ran along this path and gained momentum as gravity twisted and turned with the terrain. It would be an utter disaster, because Sonic would increase in speed until the moment the level decided enough motion sickness was enough. He would propel himself so frequently and at such velocity that it simply wouldn't be fun, and would also contradict one of the game's main goals being ease of play. I find it interesting to consider why certain mechanics were implemented and why others were passed up on. But I think the team's decisions here regarding Sonic's ability to gain speed make the most sense for this type of platforming game. Over time, I've started to come around on the run button for this reason. I used to find it tacky and wholly unnecessary, but giving the player complete control over Sonic's speed was the name of the game. I wouldn't mind seeing the run button go in the pseudo-sequel, but I'm not going to penalize the developers for trying to make the game easier to control, even if the end solution is a bit trite. This isn't to say that the developers didn't allow for any advanced mechanics that would grant the player the ability to go faster and pull off some really satisfying maneuvers. In fact, the advanced mechanics I'm about to cover contribute so much to the experience that they act as my favorite part of the entire game, if you can believe it. However, it's worth highlighting how the baseline experience works and why the mechanics they chose support the kind of game on offer. I can't stress enough how important it is that they stuck the landing on the promise of giving players full control of Sonic's abilities and speed, to which I feel they succeeded. At the same time, if there was no depth beyond those simple controls, then Lost World would fail as a Sonic game completely. A series known for rewarding players who experiment and practice mechanics would be thoroughly let down by a simplistic platformer. And this is something the developers were acutely aware of.
It's always a challenge. It's something we're thinking about in development all the time. How to add complexity for the advanced user, but keep things simple and easy on the other hand. Especially when Sonic is moving fast, you don't want to have a lot of buttons you have to push.
Now, I'd like to discuss one of my favorite aspects of the gameplay in Lost World. So let's get into these advanced mechanics. The spin dash. There are so many variations at the player's disposal. Charging with the left trigger and releasing will have Sonic burst forward briefly before uncurling and slowing down. But letting go and pulling the trigger down once more will give off a white flash, which is a cue to signify that you've engaged the everlasting variant of the spin dash. This alteration allows you to continuously charge through levels at top speed unless a hazard is struck or the player lets go. Essentially, this version of the spin dash is a modified version of the boost from other titles, but with additional control. I especially like how the spin dash controls in 3D. It feels very smooth to turn, especially when gravity shifting occurs. The drop dash is my shorthand for another variant of Lost World spin dash, as it shares its property with the move debuting in Sonic Mania. The spin dash can be interrupted by a single jump, but landing will initiate the burst of speed again, functioning like a drop dash. It's especially useful for maintaining speed after needing to make quick adjustments to Sonic's positioning. The last spin dash variation is the ball form, as I call it, in which you let a normal spin dash dissipate completely before holding down the trigger once more, causing Sonic to maintain a consistent if slower ball roll. This can actually be used to bypass certain terrain hazards such as sand, and it is quite the novelty. It's nice to have these advanced mechanics present because it encourages further experimentation, pushing the limits of an already impressive moveset. Parkour mechanics only get deeper the more you consider contextual actions. Hanging on walls in 2D during a parkour climb is completely viable when holding the leftmost button, allowing players to stall and maneuver around hazards at just the right time. Meanwhile, in 3D sections, sidestepping along walls to gain the upper hand on a forward-facing wall is completely viable, and certain level paths reward players for mastering this. Additionally, players can jump away from the wall and double jump back into the same wall, achieving the maximum speed possible. This mechanic may actually be an exploit, but even so, it functions predictably and is incredibly addicting to activate. It's my go-to form of expressing myself in this game because it's like playing your own game within the actual level, if that makes sense. Even the small addition of leaping over short obstacles is a nice feature, but you can double tap to gain a small speed boost with the mid-air dash if it's still not quite up to your speed. These hidden mechanics are worth indulging in because they give such great intrinsic value for those who are into that kind of gameplay. Oh, one more. You can hold down the run button before moving to charge the super peel out, a classic move brought back simply to give you even more options. In many ways, this is the first and only time the player is given such an expansive toolbox to work with in a 3D Sonic game, even when counting the engaging mechanics of the adventure titles and boost titles. It wouldn't be fair to say these mechanics come together in a way that reaches their full potential, or that Lost World has the best gameplay in the series because of it. I think that would be a couple steps too far from reality. But there's such a strong complexion combination of abilities that gives the game incredible replayability and continues to engage almost 10 years on. These tricks and flourishes may be entirely optional, but the advanced mechanics bring the experience to new heights entirely, and there's plenty of opportunities to capitalize on the nuances of Sonic's moveset throughout the game, even in some of the more gimmicky levels. You haven't really played Frozen Factory Zone 2 until you spin jumped over sections of the course like it's Sonic Adventure 1. The level design of Sonic Lost World is a nightmare for someone to explain or review for very clear reasons, but I'm gonna try my best to communicate how I feel about it. The tubular segments are perhaps the best and most engaging. They create the most options for experimentation, they're friendly to those who just want to go fast, and they have a lot of content contained within themselves. Sometimes the pathways are outlined in very oblique and somewhat uninteresting ways, but the options themselves always ask the player to do something else from what's happening just a rotation over. Silent Forest Zone 1 does an excellent job of presenting options for grind rail traversal while mixing in more conventional running sections as options too. On the whole, I find that the 2D sections work very well with Lost World's gameplay systems, though they can feel a bit samey with one another. Sky Road Zone 4 has fairly challenging 2D segments, but the areas feel a bit boring because there's not enough variation. However, Windy Hill Zone 2 is an entirely 2D level and manages to have interesting set pieces that affect how you handle Sonic despite its short length. Sometimes the 2D sections are mixed, but generally they are strong in the same way that the 3D sections are. Regardless, traveling from planetoid to planetoid is the main goal shared by 3D sections, akin to Super Mario Galaxy. Whether or not the parallels were intentional, comparisons made between level design of the Galaxy games and Lost World are ultimately favorable for the Blue Blur, for whatever that may be worth. Look no further than Tropical Coast Zone 2 and its use of the rocket wisps. Even if it's only used for a couple levels, the idea of having the player aim and launch themselves to a new planet with the rocket wisp is a much more engaging launch star than the one in Galaxy, which is entirely automated. Unfortunately, Lost World rests on its laurels by automating this process for most levels, but it is worth highlighting how the rocket wisp improves upon this idea. In Lost World, you can manipulate gravity with Sonic to your advantage for a faster run-through, or pull off spectacular skips. Galaxy was never designed for this, but I think it does go to show that my own parallels can be shallow when taking Sonic's mechanics into consideration. That was a shot against myself. Anyway, the overarching level design concepts are well crafted, but there's more going on here. The level design of Lost World is ultimately not as confused and inconsistent as many may claim, and that's coming from someone who psyched themselves out earlier. But for what is largely a consistent gameplay style, there are definitely some bold choices to shake things up. Choices I rather enjoy. 2 levels throughout the adventure utilize the grind rail style of play, with these mechanics also functioning with rails included in more traditional levels. Unlike previous entries, Sonic's movement and momentum is completely altered when interacting with grind rails. Think of it like a state change to the character. It sounds quite clunky, but in execution, it's incredibly fun. Tropical Coast Zone 3 and Lava Mountain Zone 2 put these mechanics to the test in what is essentially an auto-run level with several unique twists. For one, jumping between rails is entirely manual, but feels satisfying to do thanks to the great sense of control given to the player. On top of that, the analog stick can be used to slow or speed up Sonic's movement in the air, and in fact, airtime can be used to actually increase Sonic's velocity entirely. This alone gives the player a lot of freedom in speed control, just in a different way to the main style in Lost World. Gauging how much you can get away with hopping over obstacles and pushing ahead is incredibly satisfying, and I simply wouldn't have it any other way. This isn't to say these grind levels abandon all aspects of normal play, however. Gravity and terrain rotation play huge factors in switching between rails to explore different paths or even just to maintain survival. And in Lost World fashion, there's a nice rhythm to all of it. Gates need to be unlocked with properly timed jumps, enemy projectiles need to be avoided, and bomb carts pose a punishing challenge as well. This gameplay style benefits the 2D sections just as well as the 3D ones, and I haven't mentioned the most interesting mechanic. Green rails and red rails alter Sonic's base speed, which can be carried forward with prolonged jumps and double jumps. These can play pivotal roles in clearing certain doors and progression gates, once again offering a toolbox to the player that is actively fun to engage with. I wouldn't say the grind rail mechanics reach their full potential as a concept here, but as is, they are very engaging and play smoothly in a kind of therapeutic way. A more authentic form of auto-running mechanic appears a few times throughout the adventure, one that involves Sonic running forward with the player being awarded control over his jumps and homing attacks in addition to some other moves. These border on being too basic, but I think the ways in which terrain rotation is used keeps them interesting. Not to mention, Lost World's trademark air mobility can be exploited to your heart's content here, keeping the player in control at all times. Desert Ruin Zone 2 is a clear example of why the auto-run mechanics are so fun. The level constantly makes its terrain more precarious to travel on as you go along, and the player is sometimes asked to rotate along the platform quickly in order to enter the next hive without Sonic completely face-planting. It's all good fun, and provides a raw sense of speed that you wouldn't necessarily find elsewhere in the game. Perhaps one of the most derided aspects of the entire game is Frozen Factory Zone 2 and its alterations to the formula. At its core, the snowball doesn't control very differently from Sonic's base moveset. You can jump, spin dash, and roll faster with the right trigger. Instead, the snowball places restrictions on Sonic, and whether this gimmick is enjoyable or not falls entirely upon the level design, to which I feel Frozen Factory Zone 2 establishes itself as a great level. A linear obstacle course floating above the world, the level asks the player to navigate its winding paths and avoid enemy interactions without losing control of the snowball. You are still encouraged to traverse as quickly as possible, and the addition of the Yeti offers optional scripted sections to help speed you along. As you can see, this is mechanically a pinball level. The billiards boards also make a nice change of pace, challenging you to be precise in how you angle yourself to hit the balls into the holes. Not only is this a subtle preview for Frozen Factory Zone 3, but it finds a nice way to code its pinball mechanics into something that feels very winter-like. In other words, something completely different. And maybe this contributes to why the level is so confusing and derided for some, but I always found it to be consistently well designed and full of engaging challenges that stack upon each other and get progressively more difficult. The snowball never returns to a level after this, but its one appearance is so finely crafted that I keep coming back to it over and over. It's a masterclass in how to design linear challenges around restrictions placed on the player. The last alternate gameplay style I'd like to analyze is skydiving. What is often used as a mechanic of breaking up sections of gameplay in the usual style is turned into another form of auto-scrolling. It sounds horrendous, but the skydiving levels are so well executed that they promote themselves into being one of the best forms of the sky chase gameplay, first debuting in Sonic 2. As usual, it all comes down to how satisfying the controls are to use and how the obstacles are designed. Holding down on the jump button will cause Sonic to descend in his ball form, gaining slight increases in height from each consecutive bounce on an enemy. Pardon the pun, but there's an air of slipperiness or delay to Sonic's response when moving side to side, or even when descending or coming back up. It's actually a really nice way to ask the player to be precise without devolving into the inverse of a 2D shooter, if you catch my drift. I find letting the game do a lot of the work on its own is actually successful in these levels, but it doesn't grant the most satisfaction to do that. Again, it feels like the player is given a lot of freedom to exploit the base mechanics and chain as many actions together as they want without really expecting anything at the same time. Skydiving in these 2D levels may be one of the most unnecessary and unwanted ideas put into any of these games, but it's so fun thanks to the game feel that I keep coming back to them. With all of that said and done, a rather significant issue with the philosophy of variety on a level-by-level basis is the frequency in which players have the opportunity to learn level gimmicks and how the rules work. It's quite the issue. For example, the long stretch of game time between the grind bro levels could very well set up the players to fail when the mechanic comes back near the end of the game. Tutorialization, teaching players mechanics, it's consistently one of Lost World's biggest issues, I find. Before I tackle the game's boss fights, I wanted to mention that Lost World completely lacks control over the camera. I find this relatively easy to accept given the fact that the camera is carefully scripted. The camera always seems to give the player ample room to see just the right angles for exploration on a planetoid by planetoid basis. It never seems to fail in this regard, and given the variety in level structures, I think this is an acceptable solution given the execution. Lost World's boss fights have a lot of potential that is consistently fighting against the sheer power granted to the player. The Deadly Six each have their own attacks, and there are some interesting concepts for fights here, but they can still be attacked with stacked homing attacks, leading to them being utterly obliterated. It's all very anticlimactic, and only Zavok's fights in Sky Road really prove to hold on to any substance in spite of this oversight. And let's consider something. The Zeddy's lore focuses on two details. One, the tribal aspect of the bunch, and two, they have abilities of magnetism, meaning they can manipulate machines in certain ways too. My pitch on how to fix this design issue is by having each member of the Deadly Six generate a force field of sorts that restricts attacking with more than one homing attack power level. It would be justified by the little information the player has had on the Zeddy's abilities, and it would make the fights last longer, or at least their intended length. Even still, some of the Zeti don't move a whole lot, like Xena in Frozen Factory Zone 4. The player should have to catch up to them as well, otherwise they could still spam the single charge homing attack and cheese the fight anyways. All in all, you can make the fights more interesting with self-imposed challenges, but a lot of tweaking was needed to flesh these out. As I discussed at the very beginning, Sonic Lost World is the sequel to Sonic Colors. I claim that Lost World creates a new gameplay system while carrying the accessible and liked features of Colors along with it. It would be worth breaking down the similarities between the design of both games, but especially important to analyze the differences, while still primarily focusing on Lost World. Beyond the interviews I mentioned earlier, Iizuka has gone on record stating that both Sonic Colors and Sonic Lost World were designed to be appealing to Mario fans. Accessible controls, straightforward level design, and familiar art direction come to mind as some of the core aspects the games share with Mario titles. And I think that places these games in an interesting position because the methods in which Colors and Lost World execute these ideas are completely different. Interviews with Iizuka from 2013 reveal information regarding the vision. Player feedback from past 3D Sonic titles about linearity and level design was taken to heart. This inspired Iizuka and the team to develop the idea for geometric shapes, noting the tubular shape as a primary example of a new level design concept. This would award players the opportunity to have more choice in how they proceed in 3D platforming sections. Iizuka cites giving players more choices as the primary reason for Lost World's overall level design, something I feel we've already put to the test. The basis for Lost World's gameplay is rather original for the series, but it wasn't making a connection to Colors to keep up with appearances. Sonic Colors was designed to be enjoyed by Mario fans, with blocky level design and simpler mechanics taking the center stage in what was at the time a Nintendo Wii exclusive. Sonic Team crafted this experience within the confines of what is considered the Boost Sonic gameplay system established by Sonic Unleashed. It wouldn't be dishonest to say that Colors severely downscaled the daytime gameplay of Unleashed, but it was definitely done with purpose, and most importantly, it totally worked. Sonic Colors was one of the most well-received entries in the franchise for quite some time. It seems that accessibility, lower difficulty, and perhaps even the emphasis on blocky 2D platforming was more enjoyable to many critics, and fans of the series enjoyed the game for what it had to offer as well. Of course, there were a number of other changes Colors brought to the table, but I've already covered these in my 2017 review. The point being, Lost World is designed to do the inverse of Sonic Colors, almost like a transformative sequel to that game. Instead of incorporating new and accessible elements into an existing gameplay system, Lost World creates a new gameplay system while carrying the accessible and liked features of Colors along with it. And it wouldn't be too early to say that Lost World doubles down on the mindset that went into appealing to Nintendo fans. Sonic Colors simplifies the level design players would interact with using the boost formula. For one, speed was de-emphasized with consistent roadblocks, often involving platforms. Not platforming, I mean literally using floating platforms to slow you down and give you something else to do. The reliance on 2D segments and Colors also contributes to a reduction in speed and reaction-based gameplay. You don't need to compare Unleashed to Colors in order to understand this, and none of this is necessarily bad, but this is how I personally see it. In contrast, few of Lost World's bizarre gameplay segments ever restrict the player's speed or halt the sense of flow. Yes, this is the same game that captures speed in 2D sections, but it would be dishonest to ignore every opportunity in Lost World to control your own destiny, as it were. Parkour, spin dash variants, and wisps all provide the player with the means to control not just their speed, but how quickly and stylishly they want to navigate the level. This applies in 3D and 2D segments of the central gameplay style, the grind rail levels, and even the snowball level everyone seems to hate. It is simply up to you. No obstacle in Frozen Factory Zone 2 has to be adhered to. You can spin jump over everything. You can roll over anything. I'm not trying to say Lost World is consistently less linear. I'm trying to paint a picture where Colors loses out on engaging gameplay because of arbitrary restrictions in how it's designed, where Lost World aims to provide the player with options and only takes them away if there's reason to. This is personally how I see it. One of the fundamental approaches to level design in Colors is to create platforming challenges that the player navigates by jumping or using wisp power-ups in conjunction with platforming. It's an incredibly reliable method of crafting 2D platforming gameplay, but it is rather simple and loses some of the appeal found in earlier Sonic games. As I said before, platforming is often used as a roadblock to progression. This gives some of the worst levels in Colors a feeling of stalling out what is already contributing to a very short runtime. You could argue skydiving on an auto-scrolling plane is trite in a Sonic game, but standing on switches to move floating platforms is even weirder if you ask me. I'm cherry-picking examples, but it is worth noting how great a lot of the more involved levels are. Some of the early acts in particular pack a lot of high-speed gameplay with interesting 2D level design. However, even the best of these levels and colors seem to miss the point of the boost gameplay system established in Unleashed. If reaction time and maintaining speed at all costs is not the central point of enticement, then where does that leave Colors? Why does it use the boost formula? Lost World seeks to remedy this by creating a gameplay style that complements the blocky, Mario-like approach to level design. The game goes several steps further to add core mechanics and ideas that define the Sonic series, and then meld them into this familiar mold. Speed, risky jumps, the abilities that promote exploration, these are all just as important to Lost World as the blocky platforming is, if not more so. And the brilliant ways in which Mario and Sonic level design work together is what really seals the deal. I simply feel that Colors doesn't mix level design and pacing akin to Mario with Sonic's gameplay nearly as well. The game attempts to do so for its entire runtime, it is simply less effective than Lost World. Before I continue, I just want to say I hope to not come off as bashing Sonic Colors. I still think it's pretty good in its own right, but I feel strongly that Sonic Lost World is much more successful at the same design philosophy that the developers had with Colors. If all of this wasn't enough, the developers decided they weren't quite done with a certain mechanic from Colors, which leads to Lost World snatching the core feature of that game and running away with it. Especially when factoring in player-driven choice, Lost World outperforms its older brother with its own signature gimmick. In Sonic Colors, the Wisp power-ups fall into two categories. The first is a type of Wisp that allows Sonic to perform a quick action that impacts enemies or hazards around him, while the second type of Wisp acts as a transformation that alters Sonic's abilities for a short period of time. An example of the first type is the Cube Wisp, which grants the player a repetitive single action that they can perform in Sonic's normal form, slamming downward as a heavy cube to destroy blocks and invert the properties of blue ones. An example of the transformation Wisp is the Hover Wisp, to which Sonic becomes a star-like creature that can ascend and float for a prolonged amount of time. The transformation Wisps were by far the most successful when providing the player an interesting mechanic to work with. It's no coincidence then that the new Wisps introduced in Lost World all fall into the latter category, being transformations. This is done to create additional options for traversal, and if I'm being completely honest, I think this is a mechanical improvement over Colors' implementation of the Wisps. Narratively, it's a completely different story, but Lost World uses the Wisps for added variety when progressing throughout a given stage. This wouldn't be noteworthy on its own if it weren't for how Lost World also uses Wisps to offer player-induced difficulty, or rather, a reduction in difficulty. This game contains the often criticized skip feature that can be obtained after dying on a stage several times, weirdly enough. It's certainly not a feature I advocate for, especially when Sonic Lost World already has a better solution in many of its levels. Using Wisps to bypass difficult segments, often involving parkour, allows new players to customize the difficulty of these sections to their benefit. It's a far less patronizing way of making the levels more accessible, while also allowing the designers to demonstrate their abilities of the Wisps without compromising level design in the way Colors was forced to in some instances. By all accounts, the Wisps don't belong in a natural or organic way here, and were perhaps better suited to Sonic Colors in some ways, their implementation still tells a different tale. The Wii U version was quickly updated after launch to remove mandatory gyro controls, addressing my one possible issue with the Wisps. There's not much use in analyzing every single Wisp action in the game, but I will highlight three specific ones. The orange rocket makes a reappearance here after being present in both Sonic Colors and Sonic Generations, though the overhaul it received is nothing short of incredible. I really like how the rocket Wisp is handled in 3D. There's something very satisfying about that visual feedback when observing the rocket increase in velocity as it reaches its destination. In a couple of the levels featured in Tropical Coast, it actually allows for a similar gameplay loop to those found in the Super Mario Galaxy games, hopping from planet to planet with a launching maneuver that breaks up the main challenges of the stage. And in Sonic fashion, it's much faster than the Super Mario Galaxy equivalent. The Rocket Wisp gives you control over where you aim and land as well, which is much more engaging than the automation found in Mario's territory. The second Wisp I'd like to discuss is the Crimson Eagle Wisp. This is a clear example where the Wisp is designed to provide as an alternate approach to traversal, and one that is much easier to accomplish than the other tasks at hand. Yet, the Eagle Wisp can be fun for veterans too, because it's extremely fluid to control. Dashing forward is an option as well, and it can help prolong the time the player is airborne. What really seals the deal is how serene the music is, befitting of gliding through the air without a worry in the world. I will come right out and say it. The magenta rhythm wisp has very little function, but I love it anyway. By pressing the A button, you can create little indicators of where the music note should travel, and it's even possible to do basic platforming with it if you're skilled enough. But that is essentially all the wisp can do. Well, bizarrely, it can also avoid detection from the owl lights entirely, almost stunning the robot in its place. And it does carry Sonic across larger gaps, but it's pretty underpowered all around. It does, however, trigger some lovely piano music, and it makes me feel good, so yay. Despite Sonic Team's efforts, it's no surprise that Lost World's gameplay wasn't liked by many of those who enjoyed Colors, as Colors has some of that modern Sonic DNA in its design. For all that Colors did to reduce the complexities of Unleashed's reaction and skill-based design, it still contains the core gameplay of the Boost formula. Ironically enough, Lost World is a better game than Colors because it's less Sonic-like, or at least it's less focused on being a modern Sonic game. It doubles down on its vision and makes Colors look retroactively confused and stuck between two ideas. But that's just the mark of a good sequel. I still believe that Colors is a more palatable experience than Lost World for Sonic fans, and again, I consider Colors to be fine. Still, as confused as the art direction and the diversions everywhere may be, Lost World's core focus is the logical extension of taking Sonic and placing him in a more conventional platformer scheme. I'm not saying that's objectively a good or bad thing. I'm simply aiming to provide my own interpretation of what's being accomplished here. In comparing and contrasting these titles, I feel the core of what Sonic Lost World is, the reason it exists, is this: to take a gameplay style designed for Sonic and merge it with mechanics and ideas that have been successful in the platformer genre. In other words, if Sonic Heroes or Sonic Unleashed are looking inwards on how to refresh the series, Sonic Lost World is looking outward. I think you could argue this makes Lost World seem unconfident, or that the developers were being unoriginal. But I hope you can see throughout this video how I interpret the experience and find intrigue everywhere with this title. That's Lost World's gameplay in a nutshell. Intriguing. It's only a matter of time before I return to it. The art style of Sonic Lost World is one of its most deceptive aspects. At first glance, many environments and themes appear outworn and stagnant, with constant use of level tropes seen in cliché platformers from years prior. I believe the art direction suffers from cliches to an extent. It's not difficult to imagine that more could have been done visually with the premise of the Lost Hex. Earlier on, I criticized the game's lack of contextualization, and the issue is fundamentally related to the art style in this case. Even still, taking all of this into account, there's a lot to unpack. The inspirations for Lost World's art style originate from folklore and fairy tales. The clean and simple look of level geometry, as well as the simplified look of the backgrounds with rolling hills and flat structures, remind of these simpler environments of old. Better yet, one of the game's core features, the long cylindrical floating tubes, were directly inspired by Jack and the Beanstalk.
We came up with an idea of having a twisted tube type level like Jack and the Beanstalk, which may achieve this fun gameplay, so we started the experiment.
The ways in which Lost World's gameplay and visual design is synchronous begins with these floating tubes, but inspiration seems to have gone in a more notable direction.
This game is like going into the rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland, an action game where you can experience many strange and fun experiences.
Jack and the Beanstalk seems to have had an influence over level geometry that the player can run along and explore, while the environmental design and greater vision for specific levels, and their variety in subject matter, is what's reminiscent of Alice in Wonderland. The level of chaotic variations in theming within the game's stock locations is really genius, and the analogy Iizuka presents couldn't have been a better fit. Once Sonic crash lands on the Lost Hex, nothing makes sense in a familiar kind of way. Few points of references for the kind of environments the players see really exist, aside from some doses of classic Sonic imagery, though maybe that's why the developers were conservative with the world theming. One level will have the player running down a collection of beehives, while the next is entirely desert themed, before returning to a desert for the next one. Levels themed around ancient civilizations, undersea laboratories, or even floating billiards make an appearance, all of which are placed along the adventure at what could essentially be considered random intervals. That's why it's so crucial that the level icons on the world map are blacked out until you've unlocked them, leaving you surprised by a taste of what you'll be involving yourself with next. This is all very intriguing and interesting, and unique for the Sonic series as the developers intended, but there's still a general feeling that more could have been done. It all feels rather safe despite everything I just said, and I think it's because Lost World's new gameplay systems rightfully took the full focus of the experience. In other words, there needed to be a sense of cohesion and consistency to the terrain players would encounter with Sonic. And because it's a video game with an emphasis on platforming and control over every one of Sonic's moves, this larger vision ends up contradicting itself. While this is just speculation, I feel like the developers were aware of this and chose to focus on making the game fun to play, even if that meant dialing back on the absurd visuals a little in the process. It all makes sense to me, yet it is ultimately a little disappointing in its final state. The wackier the environments and levels are, the harder it is to make a satisfying game out of. Now, I can also think of many examples of platformers that use wacky themes successfully, but remember, we're talking about levels that look like this, and this, and this. Jack and the Beanstalk. When the actual level geometry of most levels have to look like this, something has to give away, and I do believe that's a fundamental flaw of Lost World's design when merging its artistry with its gameplay. It doesn't negatively impact myself or my view of the experience much, but it is definitely fascinating to me. I love thinking about this stuff. Still, at the end of the day, I can understand why some would criticize the game's utility of these classic inspirations as somewhat lacking. Perhaps the most successful inspiration comes from Sonic's old rival. I've made a couple passing mentions to the Super Mario franchise throughout this video, and I feel the connections to the series with Lost World's visuals deserve particular mention. But in a grander sense, we need to talk about Super Mario Galaxy. The Galaxy games have a legacy so notable that I'll have to keep it brief, but one thing that is undeniable is that both games successfully implement platforming along planetoids with segmented portions. You string these segments together, and you have a set of challenges that build on specific concepts, such as utilizing a drill to reach the other side of a planetoid. Even taking these gimmicks aside, the sheer act of running around a spherical planet is enjoyable, and gravity shifting provides additional opportunities. All of this is achieved with great game feel and really sells the atmospheres that both games try to exude. From the onset, it's clear that Lost World shares in this use of segmented planetoids that host different challenges. Both titles also feature 2D sections where gravity plays a role in how the players navigate the level. It's ultimately difficult to make anything meaningful out of this comparison, because the games are quite different despite some clear similarities in design. But I can say that Lost World experiments enough with the concepts shared in the Galaxy games to feel distinctive. Shallow finger pointing to inspirations from the Mario series don't really do it for me. The most I can say is that both series achieve something unique with similar ideas of planetoid hopping and gravity shifting. Regardless, whether deliberate or not, you can feel the Mario Galaxy inspiration, and I'd say it only assists in making the level design more fun to engage with. The last major inspiration actually comes from Sonic's past. While not confirmed, there's reason to interpret the specific ways in which levels bend and twist as something of a homage to Sonic Extreme, a cancelled 3D Sonic platformer designed for the Sega Saturn. These inspirations make their mark in various ways, but there's still a general lack of focus in areas of visual design that leave the player confused if nothing else. I feel Lost World's visual style is inspired, but it never manages to mix its ideas in a clean way, despite how well the game is presented in other ways. Constant variety is a double-edged sword, which deserves some discussion. In regards to Desert Ruin Zone 3, one could argue that this level is the premiere of Lost World's visual style being full of surprises as you progress.
The candy stage sticks out as a little more unusual, even more than the other stages, actually. But it still comes from what we were saying. You're in the Desert Ruins world now. Even though you might get tired of the desert after 2 stages, you're going to be in the desert for 6 stages now. Players might get tired of that. So that's coming from the idea that we want to try something different, more variety, especially in the worlds that people might get more tired of.
On the surface, I think this is rather smart, but it does beg a particular question. Why risk players becoming bored of world theming at all? It's implied that Iizuka himself is aware of Lost World's generic world theming, so I wonder why this had to be the case at all. Instead of having a plains, desert, tropical, winter, forest, sky, and lava sequence, why not embrace the more abstract ideas and flesh them out into their own world theme? Perhaps this was considered. It's worth noting that Iizuka saw it as important that the levels within a given world would never follow a given world theme as a package. It's a tricky situation from an artistic standpoint, and while I respect his reasoning, I do disagree with Iizuka on some of these limitations. Leaning into the irregularity of the level design by invoking irregular level themes could have helped greatly. It's a complex issue, and I've tried to highlight various sides here. After the player completes the main adventure, they are granted the ability to unlock stages in the bonus area, Hidden World. This is where any semblance of cohesion is completely thrown out the window, and I don't wish for anyone to take away the notion that I dislike Hidden World's visuals or think they're bad. In fact, I'd rather show my fascination for the mess instead. This is the Alice in Wonderland effect in full force. No compromises. A bright yellow sky oversees solid colored clouds in even weirder shapes than usual, and what you find in terms of level geometry is equally confusing. Zone 1 takes place on a multicolored cube with strange cube enemies getting in your way. The stage doesn't even operate on normal clearing rules, but at some point I have to skip some details. Anyway, take a look at these stage lights and the metal bars in the sky. It's almost suggesting this is some kind of meta theater for the audience to view from. I have no true explanation, which is doubly true for Zone 4. What is this? No, really, I genuinely don't understand. The strange popping bubbles, the layout of the stage, and most of all, these frightening Pac-Man clones with detailed fur? Hidden World has the advantage of having no ties to the story at all, which is all well and good, but I really have to wonder who created these abominations and for what purpose? I can only describe Zone 4 as shock value in the fullest sense. It's like something out of a horror game. A completely unexpected mixture of uncomfortable looking characters and a frustrating and arbitrary gameplay style that leaves me perplexed to this day. What makes the experience here consistently enjoyable is the polished presentation. Sonic Lost World consistently performs at 60 frames per second on the Wii U and runs just as smoothly on PC. Coming off the heels of Sonic Generations, the game features much smoother animations all around, with Sonic receiving a lot of nice flourishes to his movement that make him fun to engage with. In general, the game feels very responsive and smooth to play, even with the rather unusual environments sometimes offsetting this experience. What never seems to let up is the excellent display of color and saturation. Environments are colorful without being overbearing or overly saturated. Even the most striking examples of contrast are well executed. Silent 4 Zone 4 juxtaposes its outside and indoor areas so well that stepping outside forces my eyes to adjust before moving forward. But it's not unpleasant. It's a powerful shift in location for great effect. Every level is pleasant on the eyes, and even the most outlandish areas don't give the player a hard time in keeping track of Sonic. I feel the automated camera controls also deserve credit for keeping the game appealing to look at. I've discussed a lot of the ways that Lost World's haphazard vision compromises itself in certain aspects, but I think the camera system actually melds very well with the planetoid and tube-like areas, in the same way that these level segments both look and play well in Super Mario Galaxy. To be a bit more critical, the lighting could be more pronounced in certain areas, even with the emphasis on simple coloring. Yet my ever-favorite, Frozen Factory Zone 2, shows how well contrast can help bolster the lighting system underneath the hood. I love taking in the views and observing how the colored stage lights and billiards memorabilia interact with the dark, snowy landscape up in the clouds. Very strange combination of assets, I realize. A level like this should appear very stock and boring, yet it completely succeeds thanks to these carefully considered ideas. The right combination of visual assets to make something appealing. The stage is also lit very well and is attractive looking despite the nighttime setting. Can you see why this game fascinates me so much? You take a simplistic visual style and combine it with incredible execution of detail through other means, and it finds a way to delight. Moreover, Iizuka was very clear that simplifications to environments and lighting were done to achieve a smooth 60 frames per second on the Wii U's hardware, which is a commendable decision given how responsive and involved the gameplay mechanics can be. I feel that the art style and setting of this game was definitely appropriate given this priority, creating a world where gameplay is allowed to flourish and perform well rather than repeating a situation like Sonic Unleashed, a game that has beautiful lighting systems and detailed environments, but struggles to run at a stable frame rate and display at a clean resolution. All in all, I wouldn't paint the visual style of Lost World as a definitive win, but it is a very justified choice, and one that goes down well when you factor in the excellent presentation and performance on offer. It's a smooth experience from start to finish, and I think Sonic really benefits from this attention to visual polish. The soundtrack for a vision as unique and peculiar as this one really demands careful consideration for how it will complement the unpredictability Iizuka was adamant about presenting. Without hesitation, the two men who directed Lost World's soundtrack made some important, overarching decisions that created a recipe for success. Veteran Sonic composer Tomoyo Otani composed the majority of stage themes throughout the game's soundtrack, while Takahito Iguchi helmed a majority of the game's cutscene music and underscoring. And then there's Naofumi Hataya, who composed one one sole piece for the soundtrack, Sugar Lane. Yep, just one. There are a couple outliers, but across the game's soundtrack we can look at Otani and Iguchi as largely responsible for the compositions we have. Otani composed each stage theme to be representative of the atmosphere and emotion conveyed by the stages themselves, ensuring that regardless of what is happening in the story, the music is directly correlating with the abstract choices made on behalf of the artists and level designers. For those of you who are familiar with Lost World's soundtrack, this is why so many genres of music are featured. Practically every level is brimming with something distinctive in its accompanying score, and I'd actually like to begin by briefly analyzing the most understated stage theme in the entire soundtrack. It reveals a lot about the quality of composition work that went into every piece of the soundtrack. The selection process for this review was incredibly difficult. I have chosen various pieces to give focus to, and even then, I don't have the opportunity to cover every instrument, emotion, and structure within. While I wish I had the energy and ambition to review every piece, that really wouldn't work out here anyways. Still, I hope you enjoy it. And note that I'll be going in order of appearance, as to when these particular pieces can be heard in the game. It's difficult to tire of a piece with steadiness and drive like this. I must have heard it 100 times. Tropical Coast Zone 1 is appropriately dancing with the reggae genre through its structure and feel. Call and response is present throughout, but not intrusive. The brass states the melody and the sax's echo, but notice the steel drum. For a piece that's reliant on instruments coming in and out, it's one of the few constants. Most interestingly is the counter melody featured on the steel drum during the call and response. It's so good. The steel drum leads the next phrase with a short response from the brass, and it gives the piece a very nice sense of momentum. The final section of the form is very bright and jovial, but it works. It doesn't stray too far from the opening melody, but it brings a much appreciated sense of cheeriness to the piece as well. Excellent. The percussion deserves special highlight in rounding out the instrumentation here. The presence of accented subsidiary beats is only embraced by the percussion, which is somewhat disappointing, but it absolutely makes the piece and really lends that sense of drive. I could go on, but the point is clear. Tropical Coast Zone 1 is excellent. It's not a true tribute to reggae, but it occupies a comfortable middle ground between embracing the genre and having a very sonic energy to it. I will never, ever get tired of this piece. It's simply addicting. Juice Archipelago is as intricate as it is joyful. We've never heard a piano accompaniment quite like this in a Sonic piece before. The chordal accompaniment has a nice descending line that adds some flavor, but I'm primarily interested in the accompaniment while the accordion takes the melody. There's so many layers to this piece, and it aims to provide that unwavering level of chaos that suits the vision behind this game. In other words, it's not just a jovial beach tune for a Sonic stage, but it's this off-the-walls arrangement of character in an extremely catchy form. It's bursting with so much color, it's just crazy. With the banjo, accordion, steel drums, trumpets, and more, I feel this piece manages itself while creating a lively picture of the real-world locations that likely inspired this piece. Much has been said about the lush and introspective nature of Sea Bottom Sieg, and it is likely one of the most iconic pieces of music from this soundtrack. I'd like to dwell on those descriptors, and I'd like to discuss how the piece effectively conveys the feelings of lushness and introspection through its composition. First and foremost, the strings provide a rich accompaniment to the central melody played by the piano. I really enjoy the harmony throughout, and the subtle shifts in this optimistic feeling and somber feeling continue to delight. It all depends on the harmonic structure of the chords. But that's the thing, the piece is always taking you somewhere, and it eventually completes itself. What you have is essentially a wall of sound, but thanks to the crescendos and decrescendos from the high and low strings, the piece is pulling us along emotionally while also filling our ears with that blissful, resonant kind of sound. It's a very emotional piece at its core, and it still carries momentum with the light beat tracks without overtaking the resonance the music has on the listener. It's brilliantly executed from top to bottom. If there's one thing Frozen Factory Zone 1 proves more than anything else, it's that synthesizers continue to be one of the most valuable assets to any composer. With the pleasant additions of piano and sleigh bells, the majority of the experience is entirely synthesized. The central melody is delivered using this incredibly nice electronic instrumentation, and the little bleeps throughout make themselves useful with a funky style. Emotionally speaking, it's very bright, and always seems to resolve to a major C chord, but there's a sense of nostalgia to the ways in which the melody almost double backs itself in order to keep going. Have I mentioned that it's incredibly catchy too? You wouldn't ask much more from a winter-themed piece of music. Pardon the pun, but it really is filled with wonder, and it complements the jovial feeling of the level incredibly well because of it. It's bright, it's approachable, and it's very well composed. And then, something more emotional and intimate is done with this similar approach to synthesized music. The opening melody is sung with a high-pitched synthesizer, and it has excellent utilization of reverb. With the slower pace of this level, the winding and tilting of the world, and the lights around Sonic, it all coalesces into a very spacious kind of feeling. It's very wide, yet the music itself is so romantic in style, so it's really managing to make you feel a lot of emotions at once. The warmest oboe sound you'll ever hear just swoons you out of nowhere and hits me right in the heart. I absolutely love the timbre this creates when combined with the beat track and piano chords supporting from the back. The trumpet seems like an unfair partner for this piece, but it still manages to sound pleasant on the ears. Fusion is the key word. The classical style, romantic intentions, and almost lo-fi feel provided by the synths come together to make something truly unique. Thanks to the 3/4 time signature and waltz structure, this piece can successfully go on forever and you wouldn't really mind. I don't anyways. In fact, I've always had the idea of taking Snowball Waltz and adapting it to lean more into the jazzy side of its chordal structure. Maybe add some solos, take out the beat track, and you got a perfect piece for a nice evening. Well, a man can dream. A feeling of constant movement with a very dance-like pulse. It's absolutely incredible how much depth was squeezed out of this framework. Silent Forest Zone 1 places emphasis on its woodwind and brass instrumentation, but complements itself with this funky rhythm throughout. That syncopated feeling drives the entire piece forward, best matched by the choices the player can make during the level to boost ahead using the various grind rails. I have a hard time describing the melody of this piece because it's extremely consistent yet also varied in purpose. Above all else, the feeling of wonder is really there. It's jovial but very contained, which is the kind of combination you want when giving the listeners a lot to interpret. I'm curious, what do you feel when listening to this piece? Let me know in the comments. For me, this piece succeeds in utilizing unlikely instrument combinations akin to Snowball Waltz, but manages to also introduce rhythmic complexity not often heard in Sonic soundtracks. For as great as the Hedgehog's music is, this is simply not something emphasized often. But here, there's so much driving this piece forward, it's almost impossible to refrain from tapping your toe along with it. Returning to a classical style, Otani aims to subvert expectations once again by leaning into a tango form. The tango form goes beyond the admittedly excellent bass line and extends to the duet featuring the violin and cello. Exchanging the melodies and also filling in the rich harmonies, these instruments simply soar. The accordion helps lay on the romantic connotations further, and I'd like to once again highlight how insistent Lost World soundtrack is on utilizing the piano for chordal structure. It's absolutely sublime. The stage itself is ambient and isolated, yet feels alive in the night with the rich colors and atmosphere. Taking this further with the romantic tango is simply genius musical theming. It fits like a glove, but then... What makes Owl Lights an effective piece of music? It deconstructs the entire piece to its essentials and carefully changes the instrumentation. The intensity is raised thanks to the utilization of tremolos from the low strings. The melody is given to the mallet percussion, and suddenly, it sounds like Sonic is tiptoeing in an area of danger. Simply put, Midnight Owl and Owl Lights both display the incredible ingenuity and creativity of the composer, and manage to bolster Sonic into completely new heights with unforeseen genre representation. Wonderworld is an excellent main theme that took me many years to really come to appreciate. While the bright and cheerful emotion seemed overpowering at one point, there's really much to be heard when you listen closer. I'll keep this one brief though. You have an excellent explosion of instrument variety, the piece is being pulled into several different directions, and it has a nostalgic feel to the structure of it all, and the music is bursting with wonder. Wonderworld. It is exactly what it set out to do, and it's pretty awesome. On the whole, Lost World delivers one of the best soundtracks of any Sonic game, and that's really saying something. It's truly something unique for the series, yet the genres and styles it touches on have a Sonic-like flair to them. Above all else, I feel that the soundtrack is bursting with imagination within each and every piece. What it lacks in a cohesive through line between its individual pieces, it makes up for with this incredible detail and style within each track. And at this point, it's time to close the book on Sonic Lost World. Sonic Lost World is fascinating. Despite its mixed reception, I can't help but see Sonic Lost World as the enjoyable experience that it is. In fact, it remains one of my favorite games in the series to this day. For everything it does wrong conceptually or even in execution, it'll always remain a delight to play and a fun distraction from what could be more ideal visions for the Blue Blur. It's an endless cycle of creativity and mechanical bliss that feels just as inspired as its superior Sonic counterparts, in more understated ways. It treads into Mario's territory more than it should in theming and structure, yet the creativity and passion felt from the artists, designers, and composers makes me consider the possibility that Lost World is doing classic Mario theming better than Mario. Maybe not holistically, but the results of this attempt were so strong it deserves some thought. Sonic Lost World could have never been the sustainable 3D Sonic formula that Iizuka and the team were hoping for if they sought to double down on the appeal to Mario fans, but the attempt will remain close to my heart anyway. I'm not daft to the fact that some decisions made with Lost World negatively impacted the future of the series and alienated several fans who are excited to see the brand receive universal praise again. Even still, Lost World transfers me to a place where nobody else can go, a great sense of isolation in the most welcomed state. I've spent hours being immersed in what is considered a bizarre and almost psychedelic experience, and I really wouldn't have it any other way at this point. I wouldn't want a sequel to Lost World in a literal sense, but imagine a spiritual successor of sorts, taking all of the great aspects of Lost World's gameplay and implementing them into a more faithful atmosphere and even more Sonic-like experience. The parkour system, spin dash mechanics, kick ability, and even tubular level design could be put to great use. If I may speak a little more anecdotally for a moment, I've heard many describe Sonic Lost World as a well-made game in a backhanded sense. That it is competent and often exceptionally core designed, and that it's fun and polished, but the lack of clear identity and tone overtakes its gameplay qualities. And while I feel it's perfectly okay to think that, I simultaneously feel that hand-waving strong design principles is nothing but encouraging regression towards simplistic gameplay and mechanics. I'm really happy to have played Sonic Lost World when I did, because it's retained its effect on me all these years later. This game was released almost a decade ago, yet it still remains as an experience wherein I can feel nothing matters, and I actually mean that in a really positive way. My superego has tried to steer me away from the utter bliss exploring this game gives me, but I don't think I'll ever be able to break away from Sonic Lost World. This haphazard vision will never become dull or uninviting for me. I'll keep coming back to the Lost Hex and ignore all of the drama that comes from the video game community, and the greater problems the world exacerbates on a daily routine, just to take it all in once again. If I've described anybody else's experiences with this game, I'm happy to give you a bit of solace, but really, this was a personal recollection of my history with Sonic Lost World and an analysis of the game from my perspective. It's an imperfect experiment of ideas, yet has enough to enjoy that it poses the idea that there may have been a method to the madness. Special thanks to Harain for recording all of the PC footage when the Lost Hex attacked my previous computer's GPU. We have a very similar playstyle, and he did a great job helping me reflect what I aimed to show when I wasn't able to at the time. I appreciate the assistance so much. Another special thanks to my friend James for narrating Takashi Iizuka from the interviews utilized. I'd like to extend my special thanks to my fantastic patrons on Patreon. Please consider supporting me through there. I'll have a link to it in the description, and you can also follow me on Twitter and join my Discord server too. There's something bittersweet about this whole ordeal. I'm launching the next era for the channel with a review of a title I hold so near and dear. Sonic Lost World got me through a tough time in 2013, a time when I was beginning to figure out who I was and who I was going to be. And above everything I've credited this game for doing already, it truly helped remind me that imaginative ideas are what keeps the world truly interesting.